Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is all roads lead to Denerim in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. 51 Mother and Son. So, what do you suppose our chances are? Alistair's voice called over the din of battle. That Eamon's still alive, I mean. Percival beheaded another walking corpse, then pivoted with his shield to block an axe that came in at his back. Hugo wove around him, sinking his teeth into the shin of Percy's newest attacker. If the source of this is, in fact, his son, probably better than any of these poor saps. He dodged back from a sundering blow, then kicked out and sent the undead staggering backwards, right into the warden's prisoner. The mage cried out and backed away, releasing a pulse of energy that repelled the corpse away from himself. Percy bashed the undead with his shield, sending it to the ground. He wasted no time in crushing the thing's skull with a stomp of his steel boot. Then, while Alistair and Hugo flanked the last cluster of undead in the castle's chapel chamber, Percy turned a sour look to the mage. "Can't you cast anything useful? A fireball, or something?" "Blood magic doesn't work on the undead," Jowan replied defensively. "They don't have any blood. There's more to magic than stabbing yourself, you know," Percy growled, turning to slice apart one corpse that had escaped the ex-Templar's circle of re-death. Ever since they'd stumbled upon the blood mage, Alistair had been all for leaving him in his cell to rot, but Percy figured they might as well make use of the mage's claims of wanting to set things right. Still, Percy was watching him carefully for deceit. If the mage showed any signs of betrayal, Hugo was under orders to take him down in the most vicious way possible. Maybe it was the uncomfortable echo of this whole situation that had Percy so on edge. Redcliffe Castle looked very much like Highever from the inside, and this wasn't Percy's first time forging through hostile corridors during an enemy siege in search of the castle lord. At least this forging through the corridors of the haunted castle felt more productive than defending the town had. After spending an entire day gathering supplies, shaking sense into the smith, bullying the tavern keeper into being more than dead weight, and flat out bribing the only combat-capable person in town to help them, the battle for the village had still been a rout. Percival and Hugo had watched the road with what remained of the Arl's knights. It was depressing, how happy they had been to take orders from anyone, much less someone as inexperienced with such things as Percy. It was only after most of the men had fallen to the shambling hordes, and they were a horror that did not even bear thinking upon, and Percy was forced to retreat down to the village proper, that he saw just how ragged Alistair was run after directing the townspeople in holding off the undead coming up from the lake. By the time Percy got there, the blonde warden had apparently run out of pseudo-inspiring speeches. In the end, they'd managed to withstand the attack, but barely. The dregs of the Arl's men backed against the chantry doors. Many of the men believed it was Andrasta's own grace that had kept the undead from breaking through. Percival wasn't sure whether he should pity them or envy them for such a sentiment. Honestly, he didn't remember much of the night. Most of it was a blur of bashing and bloodshed. All he knew that he'd been bruised and bone-weary and therefore spectacularly short of temper come the following morning. And so, when Lady Isolde had come down from the keep and pulled Tegan away, Percy had been more than happy to forge through the bowels of Redcliffe Castle in an attempt to track down and destroy the source of these evils. It had just so happened that said path led through the dungeons, and thus past a certain Maleficar. Hugo leaped on the last of the corpses and started tearing into it, and, the chapel skirmish done, Alistair stormed over and glared at Jowan. "So this is a lot of trouble you stirred up, isn't it? I told you, I'm sorry." The mage's eyes darted between them, but neither warden showed anything but hostility. "I promise, if we can get to Connor, I can make things right." "I still don't like the idea of working with a blood mage," Alistair grumbled. Even so, he wiped the rotting gore off his sword and sheathed it. "Much less the blood mage that enabled the release of an army of undead," Percy agreed. "It makes Khazar look like a child playing with flint and steel." Jowan blinked. "Khazar? Surana? You know Khazar Surana?" Alistair snapped his fingers. "Jowan. Now I remember where I've heard that name before." He pointed at the mage. "You're the blood mage friend who almost got Khazar tranquiled." A ghost of a smirk crossed the ex-Templar's face. "Really good at messing things up for other people, aren't you? Tranquilled. Is he all right?" "Oh, certainly," Alistair said with a smirk that bordered on cruel. Last I heard, he was quite contentedly enchanting weapons. They say the life of a tranquil is very peaceful, you know. Oh, Maker. Jowan sank to his knees, his head in his hands. I'm so sorry, my friend, what have I done? Percy arched an eyebrow at Alistair. That was a bit vindictive, don't you think? You know what? I feel much better about working with him now, Alistair sniggered, then raised his voice. I said almost, genius. He's fine, and as hot-tempered as ever, I suspect. He's probably setting cute little woodland critters on fire as we speak. Jowan peeked up at them from between his fingers, as if hesitant to believe him. I don't understand, woodland critters? Why wouldn't he be at the tower? Well, he did get kicked out of the circle. That part was your fault, from what I understand. At Percy's questioning look, Alistair shrugged. Felicity told me a little of what happened. For example, our friend here doesn't have an intact phylactery, so the Templars can't track him. Percy nodded. Which was why Lady Isolde could hire him without fear of the Templars knocking down the walls in search of a Maleficar. He knelt to inspect Hugo as the Mabari sat beside him. The dog's muzzle was absolutely caked with congealing blood, but there was no helping that. Right, which led to this whole mess with the army of undead, and Connor being an abomination, and whatnot. Alistair glared at Jowan, eyes narrowed. I hate to say it, but apostates like Jowan and Morrigan make a really good case for why mages should stay locked up in the tower, and Khazar, legitimately free mage or no, doesn't exactly help either. Percy did his best not to wince at the mention of the witch. At least there's Felicity. Alistair hummed thoughtfully. Then, his mouth tilted into a grin. If we tried to lock her back into the tower, I suspect she'd lecture our ears off on the far-reaching moral implications or something. What a way to go deaf. Percy suppressed an eye roll, then stood, content that Hugo was uninjured. We should get moving. He grabbed the mage by the collar of his ratty robes and pushed him forward, and Alistair fell into step beside him. They ran into more undead as they delved deeper into Redcliffe Castle, but never quite as many as the chapel free-for-all, meaning everyone including the handful of knights they let in through the front gate managed to keep their limbs intact all the way to the main hall. More's the pity, in the case of the mage. What they saw when they got to the Arl's audience hall turned Percival's stomach, Tegan dancing and carrying on like some sort of jester, Lady Isolde with her shoulders slumped in defeat, and the boy who must have been Connor Guerin, playing at lordling while his hometown fell to pieces around him. Of more interest, though, was the squad of dull-eyed soldiers behind him. Not undead, enchanted. Controlled by a child. Percy found that more unnerving than the walking corpses. Percival could hear the knights following behind as he and Alistair stepped forward into the main hall. He held Jowan's robes tightly in one hand, even though the mage had made no attempt to bolt. He wasn't taking any chances with this one. The delight dropped off the boy's face as they approached. So these are our visitors? The ones you told me about, Mother. Yes, Connor. The Arlisaw's voice was as defeated as her posture. When Connor spoke, there was a dissonant echo in his voice, as if something much more terrifying were speaking with the child's voice. Percival shuddered, because he had no doubt that this was precisely the case. These are the men who tore through my guards? The one I sent to take back the town. Yes. So this was an abomination, this was what it was like to look into the eyes of a demon. Everything in Percy was screaming at him to kill it. Run it through, his mind shrieked. Percy got a hold on the heat that flared up inside him, channeling it into throwing Jowan down on the rug in front of him. We've brought you a present, Percy growled at the child. Then, to Jowan, he said. Fix it. It's not really that simple, Jowan stuttered. His eyes were wide and fixed on the abomination. Fix it, or I kill it. You dare to threaten me? Connor cried. Please, do not hurt Connor. Isolde cried, near tears. Percy wasn't moved, he was too disgusted by the spineless, underhanded shrew who had half caused this. He is not responsible for what he does. It was him. She pointed a finger wildly at the mage. That mage poisoned my son's mind, made him into this creature. Actually, Alistair said drily, Also scowling at the Arlasa, I believe it was your husband that he poisoned. I didn't summon the demon. Jowan protested weakly. I just made it possible for him to do so. It doesn't change the fact that a demon was summoned, Percy said shortly. As far as I'm concerned, all three of you are culpable. It was a fair deal. Connor roared, louder than he should have been able to. Father is alive, and now no one can tell me what to do. The Tegan creature cackled in agreement. Percy's hair stood on end, and his sword was in his hand before he'd even thought of it. As he took a step forward to behead the monster, Alistair's hand fell on his arm. Blinking back the redness that had been creeping into his vision, he noticed that the abomination was rubbing his eyes. Mother. The child's voice said, now lacking its supernatural echo. Where am I? Eyes peeked up fearfully from between his fingers. What's going on? Connor. Isolde cried, falling to her knees beside her son. Thank the Maker. Percival couldn't move, he couldn't breathe. Connor was still alive under that? No. He couldn't believe this. It was a trick, certainly. He looked pleadingly at Alistair, who watched the boy with wide eyes. Connor's face was back in his hands, his head shaking as if fighting off a nightmare. When the boy's face rose again, the previous coldness was back in his eyes. Mother, stop that. The vocal dissonance was back as well. You are beginning to bore me. Shaking, Percival slowly slid his sword back into its sheath, his rage now a sputtering, ineffectual thing. He couldn't attack Connor, not after seeing that. Something about seeing that frightened child, comforted by his worried mother, it made him think of Oren and Oriana. But let's keep this civil, the abomination said, turning to squint at the wardens. Tell me, teacher. What are these men here for? Jowan picked himself carefully off the carpet, eyes darting nervously. I believe they wish to help you, Connor. Ha! Help me? Like you helped me? You never were anything but a bumbling fool, and now I'm more powerful than you. With that, Connor swept out a hand, and Jowan went hurtling back across the hall. He hit the wall and slumped to the floor, dazed. Well. The abomination snapped at Percival and Alistair. What do you want? To kill you, Percy wanted to say. Alistair cleared his throat. We seek an audience with our leman. Do you think me a fool? Connor sneered. You would hurt my father, just like he did. The boy waved an arm at the mage's slumped form. I will not let that happen. Men, kill them all. And then, to no one's surprise, the men behind Connor leapt at his command, drawing their weapons and charging the wardens and knights. Isolde shrieked and scurried back into a corner, at least she was out of the way. Then, Tegan drew his own sword and lunged straight at Percival, his eyes wide and mad. Percival got his shield out in time to deflect, but didn't draw his sword again. That red heat burned through him, bidding him to lose himself in the battle, to give in to that rage that was his constant companion nowadays. He knew that if he drew his sword, he would do exactly that. The weight of steel in his hand would be all it would take for him to lose control and mow down the entire room. But he couldn't do that here. Even as Tegan swung madly, each impact on his shield sending a spike of anger scorching through him, Percy did not draw his sword. Tegan and the guards were innocent. They were slaves to the abomination. Connor had to die. Still stepping back and blocking Tegan's swings, Percival looked around for the boy. Everywhere he looked, soldiers in Redcliffe armor fought one another, and it was impossible to tell who was fighting for which side. Alistair was holding down two at once, Hugo had one man's ankle in his jaws, and Jowan was on the ground, fumbling around with a long sword someone had dropped. Then, Percy spotted the boy, who was now near one wall, watching the fight with wide, terrified eyes. Connor's eyes met Percival's, and then the boy shrieked and ran for the servants' exit. Seeing the innocence return was almost enough to break Percy's resolve, but then Tegan's sword slammed against his shield again. Hugo was suddenly at Percy's side, growling low as he snapped at Tegan. Hugo! Percy cried, blocking another swing and pointing to the fleeing child with his free hand. Take down! Hugo immediately turned at the command and bounded after the child. No! Isolde's voice shrieked, and she tackled the dog with more courage than Percival had honestly come to expect from her. Hugo snarled and spun, but she clung to his back, out of reach of his jaws. Meanwhile, Connor disappeared through the doorway, and Percival cursed. He turned his concentration back to his fight, only to realize that Tegan had gotten some good hits through his armor and shield. His ribs hurt, and his shield arm was beginning to twinge with exhaustion. He couldn't stay in defensive mode much longer. Sooner or later, he would have to draw his sword and lop the noble's head off. He grit his teeth and grasped for his sword. Then, a wave of magic shuddered through the chamber, and everyone stumbled under it, thrown off balance. Percy's shield was blown wide, and he fully expected the band's sword to pierce his gut in the next moment. However, when he looked up, Tegan was rubbing his head and looking around with wide, clear eyes. A brief survey of the room revealed that all the enchanted men had regained their senses, though it was far too late to save some. And, collapsed on the ground, surrounded by a spray of blood, was the reason for their renewed coherency. Jowan smiled weakly up at them, pale from blood loss and with a long sword shoved into his own thigh. His hands trembled as he attempted to remove it, but his fingers slipped and he fell back, apparently exhausted. "I'd always heard blood mages had the ability to control minds," Alistair said, also eyeing the mage. "I never knew they could uncontrol them, too. Guess it makes sense, in a really icky, still evil way." "You!" the Arlisaw shrieked, stomping over to the mess that the blood mage was lying in. Hugo followed warily behind her. Isolde stopped carefully outside the worst of the puddles, so her skirts didn't get stained. "How dare you show your face here? Tegan, kill him quickly, before he casts another spell." "Considering his last one made my mind my own again," Tegan said carefully, still rubbing his head, "I'm going to have to respectfully decline, Lady Isolde." "If it helps," Alistair said, "I don't think he's really up for another spell. Or standing, for that matter." Alistair gave the mage a flat look. "I'm sure we all feel bad for him. Poor helpless Maleficar." Percy walked carefully through the slick blood until he was standing next to the mage. Jowan looked up at him with nervous eyes, which widened in fear as Percy knelt down and put a hand firmly on the sword still sticking out of the mage's leg. He pressed down on it, making the blood mage wince. "You could have run away at any time during that skirmish," Percy growled, the battle rage still threatening to break through despite the fact that the fight was over. "But you did not. For that, you live." Roughly, he yanked the sword out of the mage's leg. Jowan cried out and tried to clutch at his thigh, but Percy batted his hands away and pulled out his injury kit to start bandaging the wound. "What?" the Orlshian harpy shrieked. "You're going to help this assassin." "Hugo," Percy said, not looking up, "third wheel." The dog responded readily to the old command. Percy heard the dog growl, and then Isolde's yelps and protests quickly backed to a much more tolerable distance. Thank you," Jowan said weakly. "You said there was a way to fix Connor," Percy said shortly. "Speak it." It's a ritual. In my grimoire, provided the Arlisaw hasn't destroyed it." Jowan's eyes flickered over to the fuming woman, now trapped against a wall by a bloody Maberry. "I can send a mage into the Fade, and they'll be able to combat the demon possessing Connor, without hurting him." "You're talking about blood magic," Alistair said, and Percy realized that the other warden was standing right above them. "You really expect us to use blood magic?" Jowan shrugged. "It's either that, or kill the child." Alistair ran a hand over his eyes. "How is it that blood magic is the lesser of two evils here?" "We'll need to begin as soon as possible," Tegan said, stepping up to stand beside a scowling Alistair. "To Jowan," he asked, "I take it you need some time to recuperate enough blood." "Well, yes, but... Percival said impatiently, prodding the wound to get the mage talking faster. Jowan winced and sat up. He was still shaky, but he seemed to be regaining some strength. "The thing is, the ritual needs three things: a blood mage to cast the spell, another mage to go into the Fade, and, a power source." Percy frowned, not trusting the mage's hesitancy. "Explain." Jowan seemed to sense Percy's waning patience, judging by how quickly the words tumbled out of him. It takes a lot of magic to send someone into the Fade. So, since this is a blood magic rite, it takes a lot of life force. How much? All of it. Slowly, Alistair said, so you're saying, someone needs to die, to save Connor. Jowen's eyes shifted between the two wardens nervously. In a nutshell, yes. No, absolutely not, the ex-Templar said. He met Percival's gaze. We can't condone blood magic. It's insane. Even without the whole, killing someone, bit. Percy sighed. In that case, we have a choice between allowing the undead to continue attacking the town, or killing Connor. Tell me, Alistair, which sounds more appealing. Alistair opened his mouth, but not words came out for a moment. Then, he closed it and gave Percival a sour look. Stop making blood magic sound like the least awful option, here. It's blood magic. A warden does what he must, to stop the dark spawn. Perhaps it is time we learn just what that means. Alistair huffed a sigh, glaring at the far wall. Fine. But we can't sacrifice anyone. What are we supposed to do, hold a town raffle to see who gets to be the one to take one for the team? I'll do it. Percival, Alistair, and Tegan all turned to stare at Lady Isolde. She was huddled against the wall, pinned by a menacing mulberry hound, but her eyes burned with resolution. Percy swallowed a swell of grief, because he'd seen such resolution before, on another mother willing to give herself to save her son. Lady Isolde - Tegan protested. I will gladly give my life to save Connors. Please. You can't be serious, Alistair argued. Look, that's very noble and all, but there's got to be another way. Maybe without killing anybody. Well. Jowen said, I suppose if I had lyrium instead, no one would have to die. But it would take a lot of lyrium. Alistair jumped upon the chance. The Circle Tower has lyrium. And, you know what, we can find a second mage there, to fight the demon. Maybe Felicity can give it a go. That stays away by boat, Tegan broke in. I would hate to risk Lady Isolde, but can we really lose that much time while that demon is set on terrorizing the town? Please, Isolde begged, braving the mulberry to take a couple steps closer. Please, I will do it now. Alistair said. There is another problem with that. We don't have a second mage. Then we will find one. Isolde cried. I will gladly give up my life, if it will save Connor. I'll kill every bastard who comes through that door to buy them time. No, Percival said, his voice rough. He stood, hoping that would make him feel less like the world was tilting from under him. He stared down at the blood-stained floor, trying to shake off the images of a blood-splattered larder. I've heard there's a collective agent in town. Jowen said. No, we are not sacrificing Isolde. Alistair arched an eyebrow at Percival. Now you're compassionate. How dare you say what I can and can't do? Isolde cried, anger flashing in her eyes. You would deny a mother's right to protect her son. Percy's rage flared up in response, and he spun wildly toward the woman. And what of your son, after your death? He roared. He stalked toward her, fists clenched. You would doom him to a life without you? With the knowledge that you had died to save him, and he must somehow prove himself worthy of such a sacrifice. The woman shrieked as he lifted her, single-handedly, by the front of her dress and shoved her against the nearest wall. Somewhere far away, someone cried, Percy. Losing a mother is the worst pain a son could possibly endure, he growled, letting go of his rage, just a bit, so that she could see what such a loss had done to him. You would take away his mother, when his father's survival is already in doubt. You're a fool and a bitch, Arla saw, but I never took you for cruel. Arms grabbed him and pulled him back off the Arla saw. He didn't fight them, merely continued to stare at the woman with that rage stirring inside him. She stared back, wide-eyed, seemingly hypnotized by what she saw in his eyes. Even Tegan fussing over her didn't make her stir. You're right, she said softly, stunned. I did not think of that. We'll head straight for the tower and back, Alistair said quickly from somewhere near Percy's elbow. His grip was firm on Percival's upper arm. If you guys just make sure to burn all your corpses before each sunset, Connor shouldn't be too much of a threat in the meantime. If you think that best, Bantegan said uncertainly. I and the men will hold the castle, then. You two will head for the circle tower. Within the hour, Alistair assured him, guiding Percy toward the door with a firm hand. Percy didn't protest, that old grief had swept up to drain him like a dagger to the heart. He kept hearing his mother's voice, bidding him farewell as he fled into the night after Duncan. Somehow, Alistair seemed to sense that, and Percival couldn't even summon up the wherewithal to be grateful for that. It was all he could do not to collapse into himself, because he couldn't say that his mother would have been proud of what he'd become. Oh sure, he was a Grey Warden, but he was one who shoved defenseless women around and sicked his doggone children. Oh, how she would have scolded him for that. Suddenly, he keenly missed the sound of his mother's voice, even if only to admonish him. Then, Percy tasted fresh air, and blinked to find that they were winding their way back down the path toward the village, just the three of them again, the two wardens and the dog. Alistair was talking. Maybe Khazar or Morrigan would be better suited for that sort of thing, but I wouldn't trust either of them as far as I could throw them. Besides, the only two places that have lyrium are the Circle Tower and Orzammar, and the dwarves are probably going to be a bit suspicious if we just walk in there and start taking their ore. Unless we pose as miners. I don't know. I think I could make a convincing dwarf, if it came down to it. Thank you, Percy said, before realizing he'd even wanted to say it. Alistair glanced over at him curiously. Oh, you're back, are you? And you're welcome. Why are you thanking me? For backing me up, in there. Alistair shrugged. I didn't want to kill anyone, either. This way makes the most sense, and does the least harm. Provided Connor doesn't attack the town again, Percy said bitterly. Well, yes. There is that. Alistair was silent for a moment, then cast a sidelong look at Percy. So, are you all right? You got a bit riled up, in there. Wouldn't you? He asked tightly. Alistair sighed. No, I suppose so. So that's what happened, huh? To your own. He trailed off uncomfortably. Yes. Percy winced at the pain in his chest. Where was that protective layer of anger when he needed it? My father lay dying from treachery, and my mother decided to hold the exit over his body against the usurper's men, so that Duncan and myself could escape. Alistair's eyes were full of sympathy. I'm sorry. And there was the surge of anger, at least. Don't be. He embraced the anger, reveled in it. The one who will be sorry is Arl Rendenhow, for daring to do what he did to my family. Percival startled as he felt Alistair's hand fall onto his shoulder. There's not much we can do for it now, but when the time comes, you won't have to face him alone. Percy nodded, the rage abating in favor of something warm. Thank you. All in a day's work, for us heroes. The weight of Alistair's hand left his shoulder, and they made the final turn into the village. So what do you think the chances are that Bodan's going to want to come with us? Percy cracked a small smile. You actually like the dwarf following us around, don't you? I'm just saying, having easy access to something other than biscuits and salted meat is nice. And come on, we're picking up lyrium. I'm sure we can pick up a little extra for Sandal to make an enchantment or two, right? Percy just shook his head and followed Alistair through the barricades, down to the town proper. Percy turned toward the docks, seeing that someone was already preparing a boat for their trip across the lake. It would likely be a long, anxious journey while they fretted about the fate of the village they were leaving behind. Percival could only pray that it survived in their absence, and prayer was not something he put much stock in these days. 52 A little bit invincible. Marnan felt a little bit invincible. She stood solidly planted on the floor as a lesser demon blasted fire into her. The heat seared for a moment, breaking through her natural dwarven resistance, and then she felt a burst of healing magic from somewhere behind her. Grinning, Marnan cleaved the demon's head in twain while it was still spitting fire. A pair of abominations behind it stumbled back as the rage demon Komu stead, and Marnan waded through the smoke with her axe swinging. They were sliced open under her onslaught, and she ignored the pain of their dying blows to tackle the desire demon that had positioned itself in the doorway. The demon wove a spell that closed around Marnan's mind like icy pincers, but she shook it off, more glad than ever for her dwarven heritage. A moment later, her axe connected with the demon's inappropriately bare torso. The demon shrieked and clawed at Marnin's face, leaving stinging welts across her cheeks and nose under her helmet. Another burst of healing magic, this time from off to one side, quickly closed the wounds. With axe in hand the warrior cleaves. A path of blood wades through like leaves. Leliana sang between her laughter. And should you ever do her wrong, you'd do well to recall this song. For bloody and proud and gory and strong, that is the warrior Marnin. Did you make that up just now? Felicity called. A spell bolt shot out from the side, slamming into an abomination that Marnin realized was clawing at her back. An arrow followed close behind the spell bolt, piercing the abomination's side. Do you like it? Leliana laughed. I thought it quite suitable for our Marnin, yes. A fine battle anthem, Marnin called, grinning despite, or perhaps because of, the battle. Any dwarf would be proud to be so lauded for her ability to wade through the guts and gore of her enemies. She punctuated the statement by whirling her axe around herself and tearing open part of the desire demon's stomach. Acrid smoke spilled out of the creature through the wound, and it shrieked. Really, now, when tsked. Felicity, if I had known you became this chatty during life and death situations, I might have opened fire in class more often. Leliana laughed. Now that is a good way to teach students defensive magic, no? Marnin chuckled herself, slamming her shoulder into the desire demon's injury. When it doubled over, a final swing buried her axe in its throat, and the desire demon started to dissolve. Something bit into Marnin's back, but a burst of healing magic from Wind's direction gave Marnin plenty of time to dislodge her axe and turn on her other attackers without any danger. The four women were on the second floor of the circle tower, having fought their way past dozens of such monsters, and likely still to face many more. They were currently positioned in what had once been an office of some kind. A ruined desk provided ideal cover for Felicity and Leliana to fire from a distance, while the single doorway into the tower corridors was an ideal choke point. All Marnin had to do was stand in the doorway and look menacing, and the creatures lined up for her axe like livestock to slaughter. Wind stood against one wall, separated from Felicity and Leliana as a matter of strategy, and Marnin agreed with the wisdom of not having both healers in a position where they could both be taken out by one fireball. The dwarf had to admit, while Felicity certainly did well enough as a healer, the younger mage had nothing on Wind's capabilities. Marnin felt not only healed, but legitimately refreshed whenever one of Wind's spells ran through her. It was rather spoiling her for any other healing, to be honest. The last abomination dropped with a messy splurge, and Marnin yanked her axe out of it and looked around. The floor around her was littered with felled abominations and the ashy remains of lesser demons. She was the epicenter of a puddle of blood and gore that completely obscured the stone floor underneath. Marnin grinned, leaning on her axe to catch her breath. Her three companions eyed the mess with a great deal more disdain than she did. Why is it I'm the only one getting dirty, here? The dwarf teased, pointedly wiping off the gore caked onto her armor. You seem to enjoy it, dear, Wind said, smiling gently. We wouldn't want to spoil your fun. Felicity, meanwhile, was looking a little green. You have part of a colon on your shoulder. Marnin dutifully picked off the offending organ and flung it away. Leliana, meanwhile, was starting to range around the room, checking chests and drawers for anything of use. Marnin wasn't sure how to feel about the recent revelation that the bard truly was quite deft with locks and traps. The Orlshian had implied as much when she had joined the Wardens, but it was another thing entirely to see it in action. Still, it wasn't Marnin's business to pry into the bard's past, though she was growing increasingly curious. Asking after others' stories would have been rather hypocritical, after all. Those were full manifestations, Felicity said at last. She raised her bag onto the desk and pulled out the large leather-bound book she was always carrying around. She flipped through it quickly with one hand, her other fumbling around in her pack for quill and ink. The demons, I mean. No hosts or anything. That means that either the veil has torn very thin here, or someone is purposely summoning these things, and they have enough ambient psychic energy to sustain their forms. Meaning? Marnin pressed, wading through the corpses to meet the mages at the desk. Well, if it's the latter, it might actually be a good sign. Felicity apparently found the page she had been looked for, and huddled over the book to jot down some notes. It means that there are still people alive in here. Unless the only ones left are blood mages, Wynne said sadly. Felicity paused in her writing, glancing up at Wynne with a frown. Do you think they would suffer being used as energy sources like that? It would be more logical for the demons to keep a handful of mage or Templar prisoners alive for the purpose of fuel. Unless they can use the abominations. I hadn't thought of that, though I doubt the possessing demon would want to share. I suppose it depends on the type. Felicity flipped a page and hurriedly started writing. Marnan leaned over to peek at the page and saw something about anchoring the animus through the veil and full manifestations in connection to partial. The dwarf could only shrug and trust that Felicity could put whatever knowledge she was collecting to good use. Hey, you ladies like books, yes? Leliana's voice spoke up, and Wynne and Marnan both glanced over. The bard was kneeling at a heavy wooden chest, her lock-picking tools arrayed around her. The older mage chuckled. I admit, I have a fondness for them, be they painstakingly researched histories or not so painstakingly researched romances. Leliana chuckled as well, then reached into the chest and pulled out a huge black book. She dropped it on the ground in front of her with a heavy thud. While Felicity barely glanced up before continuing to pore over her codex, Marnan and Wynne crossed the room to Leliana's side. Wynne knelt next to the bard and gracefully turned to the first page. The dwarf was careful not to drip blood on the book as she leaned over Wynne's shoulder. For the most part, the contents of the book were incomprehensible, even more so than in Felicity's codex. Each page Wynne turned revealed another strange symbol or design, and the few words present did not seem to be in any language Marnan knew. And as a well-educated noblewoman, she knew more than a few, at least well enough to recognize them. Wynne's brow was knit as she carefully turned each page, her eyes boring into the paper. Leliana bit her lip and met Marnan's eyes, seemingly taken aback that her find was perhaps not as well received as she'd thought it would be. What is it? Marnan finally asked after a long silence. It is a grimoire, Wynne said. A mage's spellbook. She sighed and closed the tome. It is, however, not like any spellbook that I've ever seen. It is archaic. The few rituals that I recognize are very, very old versions of ones used today. That Irving had a book of such ancient knowledge, locked up in his office all this time, why did he never tell us? Felicity had wandered over now, and bent to study the cover of the book. The black leather was etched with a stylized tree. That symbol. She ran over to grab her codex and brought the heavy tome back to the group. Kneeling on the ground, Felicity began flipping through the pages. Then, about a third of the way into the tome, she uttered a soft aha. And pointed. On the open page of Felicity's tome was a sketch, accompanied by various scribbled notes in the margins pertaining to symbolic meaning and historic precedent. The sketch matched the etching on the front of the tome almost perfectly, with any variations excusable as caused by the rendering process itself. This is one of the symbols associated with Ashabelinar. Mila told me about it when we were recuperating after Ostagar. Apparently, it's an old Dalish legend about a spirit woman who walks the wilds. The name means, woman of many years, and it's said she is a powerful mage who walked the wilds centuries ago, and continues to do so today. Marnan blinked. Flemeth. Felicity nodded and looked up at her. Yes, or so Mila seemed to believe. That's why she brought it up, because we were staying at the hut of a Dalish legend. She was practically gushing, to be honest. Flemeth? Wynne asked, shocked. You've met Flemeth? The Flemeth? Oh, I would have given anything to be there, Leliana said. I wonder if all the stories about her are true. A couple, at least. Felicity closed her codex and hugged it to her chest. She is a powerful mage, a shapeshifter. And she does have at least one daughter. Leliana, you've actually met her. Leliana's eyes widened. You mean Morrigan, don't you? I thought there was something strange about her. To think, she's Flemeth's daughter. Wynne continued to frown in apparent bewilderment. How can you be so sure this was truly the Flemeth of legend? Felicity opened her mouth, a spark in her eye indicating that she had a mentally prepared argument for the affirmative. Such arguments from Felicity were often long and rambling, So Marnan spoke before the mage. Perhaps she was, and perhaps she was not. In either case, it is apparent that this, Marnan indicated the black grimoire, is hers. After how she saved our lives and sheltered us after the battle, it is the least we can do to return it to her. Why would the mages have Flemeth's grimoire in the first place? Leliana wondered. Why else, child? Wynne said. To study it. Wynne pulled her own pack off her back and slid the book into it. Though I admit I intend to have a stern word with Irving once this is all over. Really, keeping such a find from the rest of the circle? What was he thinking? Felicity smiled, and all the women packed up their various books and thieving tools. You always did say that mage politics was a matter of madness more often than not. And getting more so all the time, Wynne sighed, and stood. As the four women headed out of the room and started back through the circular corridors, Leliana said, Felicity, Mila is the Dalish elf who is always glaring at me, yes. Marnan laughed. That is a pretty apt description of Mila in general. The glaring Dalish elf. She doesn't glare at me, Felicity said with a shrug. They turned and started heading up a staircase to the next floor. And rest assured that the rest of us are amazed by that. Leliana smiled, but pressed on with, does she know many Dalish stories, like that? Oh, yes. She has a great deal of knowledge of her people's lore. Felicity's eyes glazed over a bit, which Marnan found both curious and amusing. I can't tell you how much knowledge I've gleaned from her that is impossible to find in Ferelden texts. The historical accounts that the Dalish keep are an entirely different perspective from what stands as historical fact. It's both fascinating and disconcerting to know two different versions of history, realizing that both can't be true. I think I would like to hear some of these stories, Leliana said wistfully. I've heard a couple in my travels, but the Dalish are usually so private about such things. Oh, I couldn't do them justice, Felicity said. Don't ask me to try to storytell. I'm notoriously dull at anything requiring such creativity and finesse. You should ask Mila when we get back to Red Cliff, Marnan suggested. The elf seems to love talking about her culture. Who knows? It might make her stop glaring at you quite so fervently. Leliana smiled. I think I will do that. Their conversation was cut short by a pair of blood mages who came around the corner, spotted them, and immediately started casting. Marnan dove in immediately, barreling into the shades that the mages summoned while Leliana's arrows sailed past her, into the mages themselves. The women made short work of that encounter. The abominations that littered the floor beyond them proved of little difficulty as well. The Desire Demon and enthralled Templar on the next floor proved a bit more difficult, if only because the Templar actually had a fair amount of battle prowess. Even so, Marnan far preferred taking a few hits to letting the demon play with the poor man's mind, and her companions seemed to agree. Thus, she was forced to put the poor man down, rather than let him be the plaything of the wretched creature. A couple heals from the mages later, and Marnan was ready for her next bout. Felicity hung back in the room with the poor Templar, jotting down a couple notes in her codex, while the other three started ahead. However, the women didn't anticipate what kind of battle they were in for as they stepped out into the central hall on the third floor. Standing beside a pillar of flesh-like corruption, over the prone body of a mage, was a creature larger than any of the abominations they had seen thus far. Ponderously, it turned its eyes to them, and Marnan felt a rushing in her ears. Oh, look, visitors. I'd entertain you, but too much effort involved. Its voice was sluggish and smooth, calming like a lullaby. Marnan shook her head, feeling a strange lethargy descending upon her. I will not listen to your lies, demon, Leliana said sleepily, covering her ears with her hands. You have no power over me. The bard swayed and collapsed, and Marnan couldn't seem to dredge up the proper alarm. There's so much violence in the world, the demon cooed. Don't you want to leave it all behind? Resist. Wynne muttered. We must resist, else we are all lost. The elderly mage fell to her knees. You've fought hard. You deserve to rest. Marnan planted her feet, fighting the waves of drowsiness, even as Wynne collapsed behind her. Her mind was fogging, despite Marnan's attempts to shake off the spell. She couldn't give in to. What? What was she? No. No, Fight it. Her head drooped, and she felt the world tilting around her. Her mind reeled, but there was something, some spark of hope. Felicity. Felicity hadn't yet entered the room. She was still free of this trap. Marnan opened her mouth, taking a breath to shout a warning to the unenchanted mage, but her voice chose that moment to flee her, as did the rest of reality. The ground rushed up to meet her, and she knew no more. 53. The nature of the beast. They watched from the safety of a ridge as the werewolves milled about 30 feet below, picking over the ruins of an ancient elven city. Swift Runner, the one who had bitten Finian, was among them. Mila glanced over at Khazar as they crouched in the shrubbery. The mage was biting his lip, one hand running along the twisted wood of his staff as he considered the pack of deadly creatures below. Mila had half expected him to begin aggressive actions as soon as the wolves were in sight, but the younger elf had been uncharacteristically thoughtful in the past hours. In the hours since they'd left Finian trapped in a stone cage, that was. Mila had to admit, she'd been rather lost in thought herself, even while carefully tracking the werewolf pack through the forest. It seemed that the Grand Oak was as good as his word. Khazar's branch allowed him to offset the machinations of whatever wily forest spirit was protecting the werewolves. There could be no doubt, really, that this was exactly what was going on. Finian had been right, the forest itself wanted to protect the werewolves. The Dalish were hardly prone to blindly submitting to the random whims of every wild spirit they came across, but they nonetheless had a healthy respect for such entities. It was in their best interest to exist in harmony with such beings, so Mila found it disconcerting to be moving so blatantly against its will. What's more, why was this against its will? Did it have to do with the Dalish elves? Was Keeper Zethrian truly not telling them everything? That a keeper would so withhold information, when it would hurt his people to do so, it was unthinkable. And yet, do you think he was right? Khazar suddenly whispered, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. Mila didn't have to ask what he meant. It seemed it weighed heavily on the mage's mind as well. They do speak, she whispered back. That shows some degree of control. There is more to this than the keeper told us. Khazar bit his lip again, looking over at her with uncertainty, an expression that, on him, was both refreshing and disconcerting. What if Witherfang's heart doesn't cure the curse? Mila didn't answer, because doing so was unnecessary. They would lose not only the Dalish elves, but Finian as well. After a moment, she said, we should speak with them. They both peered through the foliage. The werewolves were sniffing around suspiciously below, and Swift Runner's head swiveled around warily. Had they been detected? Khazar swallowed, and nodded. There are obviously two sides to this story. We've only heard one. They traded a look, for once in full agreement. And what a startling agreement it was, for them to try something this rash. But they had to, for the sake of their comrade. Khazar smiled wryly. I swear he planned it this way. Still, when Mila stood and stepped up to the edge of the ridge, he dusted himself off and followed. Swift Runner. Mila called. Immediately, the werewolves spun and growled, taking up battle stances as they peered up at the elves. Swift Runner bared his teeth as he spoke. HRR, you dare to approach our sanctuary. We would speak with Witherfang. You think we are fools, elf? The werewolves growled in agreement. You will not harm our lady. Mila paused, confused as to who this lady was. Khazar took up the conversation. We don't want to harm anyone. We just want to talk. Zethrian's a big fat liar, so we thought we'd get your side of the story before we do something stupid. Swift Runner growled, but didn't answer right away. He looked between the two of them, then sniffed the air. Where is the third one? The one with the knives who spoke for you before. You bit him, Khazar snapped. Where do you think he is? We had to put him in a cage just to stop him from eating us. Swift Runner quirked a head to one side. He still growled, but Mila was beginning to think that was a fairly constant sound with him. HRR, he has not found his mind. You bring him to the lady, and she can tame him. We would rather cure him, Mila said. And you? That is what you want, is it not? To be free of the curse. This was met with barks and growls from the other werewolves that Mila could only hope was a scent. Swift Runner stared up at them, his eyes narrowing. "Very well, Dalish elves. But if you betray us, we rip you apart." Mila nodded, thinking it best not to correct the vicious beast in its assumption that Khazar was Dalish. She grabbed a vine hanging near her feet, and swung off the ridge by it. It flung her over the werewolves, and she slid down it deftly as it pendulumed back. She landed deftly on the ground in front of Swift Runner. The werewolf stepped up close, and it took all of Mila's self-control not to draw her knife or make any other hostile actions as it loomed over her. Instead, she stood perfectly still as the werewolf's fetid breath ghosted over her. He sniffed around her gingerly, as if checking for the odor of trickery. Who knew, perhaps werewolves could sense such a thing. She stood, unflinching, as the teeth came within inches of her throat. "Very well," Swift Runner growled at last, stepping back. "Come, we will take you to the lady." And with one last backward glare, the werewolves started off toward the elven ruins. There was a rumble behind her, and Mila turned to see Khazar riding what looked like a slow-motion rock slide down the cliff face they'd been above. His brows were knitted in concentration as he pushed the stone under his feet, riding the rock like a lift. When he was at ground level, he jumped gingerly onto the dirt path next to Mila, though he did turn to look up at the deep vertical furrow his magical stun had cut in the cliffside. Khazar leaned on his staff, seeming to need the rest. At Mila's questioning look, he nodded back toward the ridge. "I have to say, control takes a lot more effort than just letting go and destroying everything." Mila considered that, looking up ahead where their unlikely guides had disappeared into the trees. "I suspect that is true in more than just magic." It was surprising how quickly Khazar caught on to her meaning. The two elves seemed to simply be in accord over this entire affair. She could not guess whether that was a good sign or bad. Even so, she followed the tracks that Swift Runner had left, winding their way deeper into the ruins. Both were well aware that this was likely a trap of some sort. However, both were confident enough in their own abilities as well as desperate enough to take the risk. Silently they followed the tracks down to a stone entrance into a large ruined building. The werewolves had long since disappeared inside, but she could hear their growling tones echoing about as if in a large hall. Mila found her steps faltering slightly as they proceeded inside, and a heavy stone ceiling closed in overhead. The last time she had been in such a structure, Tamlin and herself had been beset by undead, and then cursed with the taint. What's more, the stuffy, confined feel of such stone structures made her all too aware of just how few escape routes there were, should trouble arise. She couldn't retreat into a tree and snipe from the upper branches here. Nor could she blend into the shrubbery. She was hopelessly exposed and vulnerable, and, above all, trapped. It was a sensation that made her feel an unexpected stab of empathy for the flat ears who had to endure this on a daily basis. One such flat ear beside her stepped into the building as if it was no big deal, apparently unaware of how disconcerting being enclosed was. He had grown up enclosed, she realized. In fact, he hadn't known anything else until he'd been recruited into the Wardens. It was a strange idea, when, to Mila, it was the exact opposite. Khazar turned a quizzical look back at her, and she realized she'd stopped in the doorway. Shoving down her nervousness, she tilted up her chin and strode into the chamber. Such fear had no place here, they had things they needed to do. Swift Runner was waiting for them off a side corridor. He watched them with narrowed eyes, but nonetheless turned and led them into an even more confining stone hallway. Khazar cast her an arched eyebrow, and Mila realized she was breathing much too quickly. She forced herself to calm. Her people had once lived in cities like this, long ago. She could stand it for a little while. The corridor opened up, and they were greeted with a chamber full of snarling beasts. Werewolves surrounded them from all sides, too many for even Khazar to take out before they ripped him to pieces. Judging by the widening of the young mage's eyes, the same thoughts were passing through his head. Here, they were truly at a disadvantage. Now, they could only put their faith in the mercy of these beasts. Standing in the center of the chamber, lit by a stream of sunlight coming down from the ceiling, was a spirit that Mila could only assume was the lady. She was beautiful, a creature who encompassed both the savage power and the wild beauty of the forest. Her eyes were black and fathomless, and her only coverings were the vines that wrapped around her legs and arms, as much a part of her body as her midnight black hair and her smooth, silver skin. Mila's mouth went dry, and she fought not to fall to her knees in awe of such a lovely creature. "I bid you welcome, mortal," she said in a voice that echoed with the voices of 1,000 trees. "I am the lady of the forest." "I admit," Mila registered Khazar saying through her haze, "I was expecting another werewolf." Swift Runner growled, stepping up to menace the small elf. "You will speak with respect to the lady." The lady lifted one hand to the wolf's shoulder, and he instantly calmed. "Hush, Swift Runner. Your urge to battle will only see the deaths of those you are trying to save. Is that what you want?" Transfixed, Mila noted that the lady's hand was made of graceful wood, though it was also twisted with age. "No, my lady," Swift Runner said, mollified. He looked at the two elves with apparent contrition, and Mila began to understand why this spirit protected these creatures. "Then the time has come to set our rage aside, and speak with these outsiders." She turned back to the elves. "No doubt you have questions, mortals. There are things that Zithrian has not told you." "That, we'd gathered," Khazar said. Mila struggled to find her voice. "What would you have us know?" Something in her voice made Khazar's head whip around to stare at her. It was Zithrian who created the curse that these creatures suffer. The same curse that Zithrian's own people now suffer. Mila listened raptly, as the lady of the forest told her tale. When he was young, Zithrian's family had been accosted and killed by a nearby tribe of humans, a tale that echoed what Ishal, her guardian, had once told Mila about her own parents' deaths. In revenge, Zithrian had summoned the lady and bound her to a wolf with her fang to wreak havoc upon the tribe. All the humans, not only the ones who had committed the crime suffered, and the tribe fled, leaving the werewolves behind. Once, perhaps, Mila might have dismissed this as justice well served against the Shemlin, but now, she wasn't so sure. Looking into the face of this noble spirit, and seeing the long suffering in the eyes of the werewolves around her, Mila realized that perhaps Dalish vengeance did not supersede all else. The elves had been enslaved and cast out of their homeland. But that did not make right the fact that these creatures struggled with their sanity every day, and spread their curse simply as a matter of their natures, whether they willed it or not. "Why did you attack the Dalish?" Mila asked after the story had been told. "To force Zithrian to act. We have sent Zithrian word every time he's passed this way, but always, he's ignored us. This time, we will not be denied." Swift Runner stepped in, passion ringing through his rough voice. "We spread the curse to his people, so he must end it to save them. And yet he does not," Mila said bitterly, anger sparking within her for the sake of the werewolves. She understood now, why Zithrian asked for Witherfang's heart. Why he denied that the werewolves were any more than mindless beasts. Even with the lives of his clan on the line, he merely seeks revenge. "I'd never thought a keeper could be so small-minded. So petty." "Please, mortal," the lady said, stepping toward Mila. "You must go to him. Bring him here. If he sees the creatures, hears their plight, surely he will agree to end the curse." Khazar snorted. "Somehow, I doubt that." "In that, the boy is absolutely correct," said a new voice behind them. The chamber filled with noise as the wolves snarled and bayed, but Zithrian was unmoved as he entered the chamber, strolling in with his staff swinging. "Hello, spirit," Zithrian said coldly, coming to a stop some distance behind Mila and Khazar. Swift Runner bounded up and towered before the keeper. "She is the lady of the forest. You will address her properly." "Swift Runner, stand down," the lady said softly, and the werewolf returned to her side. "You've taken a name, spirit? And given names to your pets?" "It was they who gave me a name, Zithrian, and the names they take are their own. They follow me because I help them find who they are." "Mindless beasts, my ass, you manipulative bastard," Khazar muttered, glaring at the keeper. Mila couldn't help but agree with the mage on this one. Who they are now does not change them from who their ancestors were. A point that you two, he turned his cold look on the wardens, would do well to remember. These creatures were Shemlin, once. They deserve nothing but to wallow as they once had us wallow. "The Shemlin who enslaved us are long dead, keeper," Mila said. as are the ones who harmed your family. These beings before us have done nothing to deserve their fates. And you call yourself Dalish? Have you forgotten, then, what it is we fight for? The implication stung, but she held her ground. She turned to face Zithrian fully, well aware that in doing so, she was showing her back to the lady and the werewolves. It was Zithrian, now, who she was wary of. I am Dalish, and I do not need your approval to claim myself as such. I follow the Virtanadal. You, on the other hand, have forsaken it. You dare to lecture me on the Virtanadal, child? I do, as that is my duty as a devoted child of Andruil. Mila took a step towards Zithrian. The way of the arrow, you have forsaken, for your unwavering duty as keeper should be to your people. The people in the present, keeper, who suffer from the curse you caused. Another step. The way of the bow, you have forsaken. You do not bend when necessity demands it, grown stiff and brittle with time and anger. As such, you lose your utility as a leader and a father figure, and weaken the clan as a whole because of it. Mila stopped 2 steps in front of the keeper, meeting his unwavering gaze with one of her own. She could see the doubt in his eyes. And the way of the forest, you have forsaken. You think yourself a lone figure of vengeance, but it need not be that way. If you release your isolation, and at the least grant these creatures their humanity, you can end the suffering of not just your own people, but of all the people affected by this curse, Elvain, Shemlin, or spirit. That I cannot do, the keeper said firmly. I am sorry, child, but you ask too much. I held my daughter in my arms as she died. These creatures killed my son and daughter, and that is something I can never forgive. An impasse, Khazar said from somewhere behind Mila. Wonderful. Are you certain that is the only reason you won't end this curse? The lady asked ponderously. Zithrian's lips pressed together, and Mila turned her head enough to ask for an explanation, but not enough to let Zithrian out of her sight. Witherfang and I are bound as one being, but such powerful magic could not be accomplished without Zithrian's own blood. A blood mage, Khazar breathed. Your people believe you have rediscovered the immortality of the ancestors, the lady continued to the keeper, but that is not true. As long as the curse exists, so do you. No, the keeper denied a bit too quickly. That is not how it is. Coward, Mila hissed, and heat flared into the keeper's eyes as he glared at her. So, out of curiosity, Khazar said. If we were to kill him hypothetically, would that end the curse? No, the lady said. His death would not end the curse, but his life relies on its existence, and I believe his death plays a part in its ending. Then we'll kill him now. Swift Runner howled. Let's tear him apart. For all your powers of speech, Zithrian sneered, you are beasts still. By killing me, you would destroy your only chance at ending it. Only I know how the ritual ends, and I will never perform it. Then we'll just have to beat it out of you, Khazar said sharply, lightning dancing up his arms and around his staff. You would turn on one of your own kind. Zithrian snapped at the mage. Then you are no better than these beasts. That's a comparison I will wear with pride, if it means I'm less like you. Zithrian turned to Mila. Come, Delenn. We will put down these creatures. For the pride of the Dalish. Mila didn't even deign to shake her head in response. I will do no such thing, keeper. Then you will die with them. The elder elf skittered back, raising his staff in the air. Glowing lights surrounded the werewolves, trapping them in lit prisons that they could only struggle vainly against. The lady of the forest transformed into a white wolf and howled in pain or rage, it was difficult to tell which. The howl was answered above them, and another werewolf fell from the hole in the ceiling, landing nimbly in the center of the room, in front of Witherfang and Khazar. This werewolf was also surrounded in a nimbus of light, but rather than confining, this one seemed to be controlling it, guiding it like a leash. Mila had her suspicions, as she took in the werewolf's rough brown fur and relatively smaller build. And when the wolf threw back its head and let out another baying howl, Mila caught a flash of familiar brown eyes. Mila didn't have time to think about it as a cone of frost blasted into her from Zithrian's direction. The huntress rolled to the side, out of the effect area, but not before her left arm had already gone stiff and sore from the cold. She skittered away from the mage, drawing her bow. Her first arrow flew straight for his heart, but he negated it with a blast of fire that burned it to ash before it arrived. The two Dalish elves backed into opposite sides of the chamber and began slinging attacks at one another, a deadly battle of arrows and icicles raining through the air between them. Meanwhile, Mila was peripherally aware of the rest of the battle. The trees in the chamber had uprooted themselves, becoming lumbering sylvans that Khazar kept back with a constant ring of fire spells. One of the sylvans was already crackling and falling apart. However, Khazar was having difficulty because of the werewolf that dogged after him, interrupting his spells and forcing the mage back on his heels. Already, the boy's form was a bloody mess of welts from the wolf's claws, his robes hanging in tatters. All the while, Witherfang and the werewolves howled and snarled from within their prisons of light. Mila's arrow hit its mark in Zethrian's shoulder, but the elder elf was unfazed. Instead, Mila felt her heart go cold as she saw the blood from the wound coalescing in the air around the keeper. Blood swirled around him, pulsing with a strange rhythm, and then he swept his arms forward, toward Mila. She was blasted halfway across the room, only her instincts making her duck into a roll in time to stave off severe injury. Even so, she would be bruised. She rolled under one of the decimated sylvans that littered the chamber, coming up right in front of Swift Runner. The small one. The wolf cried, though his voice was muffled, as if spoken through water. Mila turned to look for Khazar, and went cold as she spotted him. The Finian werewolf was on top of him, savagely ripping into his chest while the mage's hands sparked feebly. He was out of magic, Mila realized. Without thinking, she drew back her bow and sent an arrow slamming into the wolf's side, and the wolf rolled off the mage. Mila didn't waste any time in sprinting toward the other elf, digging into her pouch for the herbal concoctions she had been practicing on. She could only hope they were at least partially effective. The werewolf leapt up to meet her before she could close the distance to Khazar's shuddering form. The wolf's snarling face was abruptly in hers, and only a timely duck saved her from losing a good chunk of her face to a swipe of those sharp claws. An aura of leaves grew to surround the werewolf, and the beast hesitated before its next swing, shaking its head roughly. The lady's muffled voice reached her ears. "I've settled his rage for the moment. Speak with him. Quickly." Mila put her trust in the spirit, even as she shot an arrow across the room at Zethrian, who was reviving the sylvans. "Finian. Listen to me, Lethalin." The werewolf howled, snapping out at her, but she didn't flinch. "I know you are in there. You do not wish to do this, Lethalin. You are not Zethrian's slave, or anyone's." The wolf snarled, but stepped back, shaking its head again. Zethrian's leash of light around him twisted and tugged, and Mila took that as a good sign. "He cannot control you." Mila pointed toward the mage, who was surrounded by blood as he summoned a pair of shadowy demonic creatures, seemingly from straight through the veil. "Free yourself, Lethalin. Bite the hand that would trap you." Sure enough, with a feral growl, the werewolf turned and bounded across the room, the leash of light snapping apart. The Finian wolf barreled into the keeper just as the shadow creatures manifested, and all three enemies were soon consumed by a whirlwind of snarling fury. Mila sighed in relief and sent a smile of thanks to the lady, who nodded back. Then, the huntress closed the rest of the distance to the mage. Khazar seemed to have started patching himself up with previously provided poultices, though his entire torso was still a gory mess. When Mila offered him one of her lyrium potions, he made a face. "Ugh, homebrewed." Still, he downed it without further complaint, and another quickly applied poultice in an injury kit set him right again. Mila helped the mage to his feet, and they looked over to see their unexpected ally diving and rolling around the two shades with all the dexterity of an elven thief, and then savaging them with all the strength of a werewolf. It was a potent combination. Khazar picked up his staff from where he'd dropped it nearby, and Mila watched from the corner of her eye as he waved it around. Meanwhile, she sent a well-aimed arrow through Zethrian's right arm, interrupting his next spell. A moment later, roots reached out from the walls of the chamber and closed around the elder elf, and the stone floor snapped up to clamp around his ankles. Within seconds, the keeper was bound by roots and rocks, and stretched out at their mercy. "Release them, Zethrian," Mila said, "or your own creation will tear you apart." She indicated Finian, who had already utterly destroyed one shade, and was making short, vicious work of the other. "Very well, the keeper said, his head hanging. I cannot defeat you. He waved a hand within the confines of the roots, and the werewolves abruptly broke free of their cells. The white wolf immediately leapt forward to take out the last shade, then turned to confront Finian. The Finian wolf showed no signs of calming at first, growling and leaping upon Witherfang. However, a swift tussle between the two soon had the werewolf at Witherfang's mercy, the white wolf's maw at Finian's throat. The white wolf transformed back into her spirit form and whispered softly in Finian's ear, and the cloud of rage started falling from Finian's eyes. Fascinating, Zethrian whispered, that she can so tame such beasts. Not tame them, Mila said. Free them. Sure enough, when the lady stood up, the Finian wolf was looking around with wide, clear eyes, and Mila wondered how much the creature that had once been their friend understood of the situation. The lady approached the keeper's strung-up form. Then let us get this done at last, Zethrian. Zethrian stared at her, long and hard. His head drooped, and his voice was broken as he spoke. I cannot do it. I am too old for mercy, all I see are the faces of the ones who killed my children. Then maybe it's time to end it, Khazar, surprisingly, said, leaning heavily on his staff. I have lived with this hatred for a very long time. It has consumed me like an ancient, gnarled root. I, too, desire nothing but an end, the spirit said gently, and Mila's heart ached for the heavy echoes of years in her voice. I beg you, Maker. Put an end to me. She swept out her arms, and the werewolves all bowed their heads. We beg you. Show mercy. Silently, slowly, Zethrian nodded. Khazar released the root bindings and stone shackles. The keeper stepped forward, head bowed. You shame me, spirit. I think it is time. Let us put an end to this. The two moved to face one another, and wolves crowded protectively around their lady. The air was thick with anticipation, with longing. And then, a flash of light, and it was done. Zethrian fell dead, then the lady faded in a white light. One by one, the werewolves began to glow as well, and each shrank and reformed. Humans and elves alike fell to their knees in a circle around where the lady had stood, bearing clothes of different origins, of different lifestyles. One was a rich merchant woman, another a gruff human in old robes, another a Dalish hunter in leathers. Among them, too, were humans who bore no clothes at all, who had never been fully human, born with their curse. And then there was Finian, near the back of the group, staring at his own hands. The human who had been Swift Runner, now a tall man who was one of those who bore nothing, stepped forward. It's over. He said roughly, seeming to have difficulty working his human jaw, even as he marveled at it. She's gone, and we're human. I can scarcely believe it. Mila and Khazar shared a smile. Grey Wardens, Khazar said with a smirk. Heroism is what we do. Or so we're told. Will you be all right to get out of the forest? Mila asked. The man chuckled. Oh, don't worry about that, we have lived here for many years, no matter what form we've taken. We will find other humans, see what's out there for us. He bowed his head. Thank you. We will never forget you. One by one, the former werewolves expressed their gratitude, some bowing heads or exchanging words, while others insisted on shaking hands or touching them in some other way. One large man swept them both into a tight hug, making both elves stiffen in discomfort. Their mutual horror as their eyes met over his shoulder was certainly a bonding moment between them. Finally, it was just the three wardens left in the chamber, the two of them standing awkwardly, and Finian sitting with his head bowed. Their companion had yet to acknowledge them, and Mila worried that something was wrong. Did becoming a werewolf do something to one's mind? What if he'd been legitimately hurt? Hey, Finn. That was Khazar, daring to limp closer and crouch down next to their fellow warden. Gently, the mage prodded the pickpocket in the shoulder with his staff. You okay? Finian's form shuddered, and then something that looked suspiciously like a tear glinted in the air under his downturned face. Mila and Khazar exchanged an alarmed look. Mila felt a distinct twinge of anxiety. During her time among the wardens, particularly this last week, she had come to think of the two elves as kin. And it worried her, to see a young man that she considered of her own clan in such a state. She knelt down beside the elf and laid a hand on his shoulder, and that seemed to break some sort of internal dam. He shuddered again, and a sob burst out of him, and then another. His hands went up to cradle his face while he wept, and it was all Mila could do to drape an arm around his shoulders and wait it out. In a Dalish, such tears as she had now seen both fellow elves exhibit would have been a weakness. With these two, however, it seemed there was a sort of strength in it. Neither was prone to acknowledging their own troubles in such a way, and so, as horrifying as it was to see Finian reduced to tears, she also knew that he needed the release. If he had smiled and jested after such an ordeal, she would have found that far more worrying. She winced inwardly. These were very undalish thoughts. Maybe Zithrian had had a point, and she was forgetting herself? There was a thud as Khazar sat down in front of them, his lips pursed in thought. No snide remarks, no impatience, or scoffing, just silent contemplation. Could it be the young elf was growing up? I'm sorry, Finian's voice croaked thickly from behind his hands. I'm so sorry. If this is about mauling me, Khazar said, then forget it. I'm surprised no one did it sooner, though I always expected it to be the Templar who cracked first. A cracked laugh escaped the thief, and Finn wiped at his eyes. Not for that. Finally, he looked up, and Mila caught a glimpse of watery eyes before they darted away to stare at a wall. I don't deserve this. Not after all those terrible things I said. Mila fought back the stinging memory of it. You were not yourself, Lethalin. Finian shook his head. But I was. And the worst of it, you don't even know. Now, Khazar did scoff. What, that you manipulated us into talking to the werewolves? You really expect us to be mad about that? Finian blinked, his eyes flitting between them in surprise. You knew. Yeah, duh. And, honestly, I'd be madder if you hadn't. Can you imagine if we'd tried to kill Witherfang instead, and just ended up finding out about what a jackass Zithrian was afterward? And then we'd have had to explain to everyone why you didn't come back with us to Red Cliff. Khazar made a face. Yeah, Finn couldn't really come. Why? Oh, he's probably devouring innocent children right now. That or chasing his tail. Yeah, he has a tail now. Right, that'd go over real well. Finian laughed, though it was still cracked and hoarse. For what it's worth, Mila said gently, in the future, I would hope that such dissembling will not be needed. I think you've proven yourself insightful enough that can simply give your opinions on such things outright, without resorting to manipulation. Finn nodded slowly, his fingers running through his hair. It's a hard habit to break. No one listens to an elf, otherwise. Perhaps not an elf, Mila conceded. But to a Grey Warden, they do. And you are that, now, as much as any of us. They especially listen, Khazar said, sitting back with a glare, when you imply that they'll get some sort of reward for helping the werewolves. I fully expect some kind of payment for all this goody two-shoes crap, just so you know. Finian laughter was fuller now, his usual spirit re-emerging. Duly noted. Mila helped pull the thief to his feet, and the three of them started winding their way out of the ruins. Khazar picked at the tattered robes, the remains of the fabric now growing stiff and brown with his blood. Ugh. I think I'll start by requesting a new set of robes. Finn, you think you can liberate one of Zithrian's sets when we go back through the camp? He won't exactly need them. Finian cast the mage a sly smirk, though it remained somewhat reduced. I don't know, the tattered look is good on you. Really matches the facial tattoos and oak branch staff for a Mad Wilderness mage flavor. What, you're trying to turn me into Morrigan now? They stepped out into the high-ceilinged hall of the entrance chamber. Or should I start asking dumb questions and trading cheap ornaments for giant acorns? You never do know when we'll have to placate a giant squirrel, the pickpocket said solemnly. Mila smiled. I approve of Khazar getting in touch with his less domesticated roots, she admitted, not without humor. She paused to give the mage a considering look. The forest looks good on you. Khazar just rolled his eyes. Oh, you would say that. For a minute back there, I was worried that you'd try to get undomesticated in the middle of negotiations. Mila furrowed her brow, even as Finn stifled a laugh. I do not understand. Don't you? Khazar arched an eyebrow, but now he was grinning too. The mage clasped a hand to his chest and spoke in a falsetto, "Oh please, noble forest spirit, let us help you. In return, I only ask that you ravage me with wild abandon. Admit it, if she'd asked it, you would have knelt down right there and pleasured her. However you'd do that to a woman who's part tree, anyway." Finian barked out a laugh, seemingly at Khazar's sheer audacity. Meanwhile, Mila felt her face go red, because Khazar wasn't far off the mark. She had been rather taken with the lady. But it was merely awe of such a noble, beautiful creature, certainly. Finian nudged her side, his smile bright and soothing. "I was there, remember? From what little I saw, he was staring too." "Well, she was naked," Khazar said crossly. The conversation fell away as they stepped out of the ruin and into the sunlight, and Mila had never been so happy to breathe the forest air again. She inhaled deeply, closing her eyes and savoring the feel of the breeze on her face. Guys." That was Khazar, who pointed at a lone creature up the hill in the path ahead of them. It sat in the middle of the path, still and silent, a white shape against the muddy, grassy forest backdrop. Finian gasped, "Is that?" "It can't be," Mila said uncertainly. The spirit was released. Carefully, they approached the white wolf. The creature watched them with calm eyes until they were within 10 feet of it. The wolf's eyes pierced into Mila's, its gaze both soothing and empowering. Then, with a flick of its ears, it rose and ran off into the forest, disappearing into the trees. The three elves watched the white wolf go. "Mila, why was it staring at you?" Khazar asked. "Its mind is its own," Mila said with a slight shrug. "Perhaps for the first time in a very long time." Finn smiled at her teasingly. "I think you made a friend." "Perhaps I did," Mila said, and she could not help but smile. She looked pointedly at her companions. "I seem to be doing that quite a lot as of late." "Careful you don't get too many," Finian said gravely. "It can get quite addictive, having so many people to talk to. You start actually caring what they think and everything." Khazar snorted. "Is that the excuse you're going with now?" Finian grinned and shrugged. "It's one I'm testing out." "What do you think?" Khazar blinked, then his eyes narrowed, and one corner of his mouth twisted into a smirk. "I see what you did there. Can't fool me, you silver-tongued rascal. You're trying to make me into a friend." Finn winked. "Oh, you're too smart for me, Khazar. Now I realize that I will never wheedle my way into your good graces, for the company you keep is very exclusive. Damn straight. And you could certainly never care for a comrade. Such emotions make you weak, after all." "Yep. Why, the likes of Khazar Surana would certainly never risk his life to help another. Such rash actions as, say, walking virtually undefended into a werewolf lair for the sake of another is certainly below you." "Shut up, Finn." Mila couldn't help but chuckle, and it wasn't long before all three of them were laughing in earnest. All the while, in the trees, Mila felt the continued eyes of the white wolf watching. But rather than unnerving, she found the gaze comforting. And as they wound their way through the forest back to camp, she was happy to sense the white wolf follow. 54 Rumors and Overheard Conversations. When the whispers started rippling through Orzarmar, Okaran didn't pay them much mind. What did he care if another sodding grey warden had wandered into the city? One had been in a couple months back, and Okaran had been sick of the brouhaha then too. Still, at least it made better listening over his cups than all this lamentation about the various tragedies that had recently befallen House Ejikin. He much preferred brooding in a corner while listening to rumors about some lucky sod of a casteless who had returned to the city as a warden, than brooding in a corner listening to rumors that Lord Harrowmont had killed the king, or that Prince Belen had killed his entire sodding family. At least the rumors of the ascended casteless came with supposed accounts of the warden's amazing prowess at the proving, and his courage and valor in the deep roads. Whole bunch of nug piss, as far as Okaran was concerned, but at least it was decent entertainment. Thus, he wasn't sure how to feel when the warden walked into Tapster's and parked his legendary keister at the table right next to Okaran's. It was a busy evening at Tapster's, the usual bustle of the front room more lively than it had been since they'd closed the great doors to the surface. Everyone just seemed to want to talk, lately. Talk and get drunk. Okaren was on board with the second one, at least, though he'd have preferred it if he had a buxom beauty or two to have a conversation with himself. Not many ladies seemed to want to associate with the local laughingstock these days. Not since Felsi left. He sat alone at a table in an alcove at the back of the tavern, nursing his 5th, 7th, 12th mug. The warmth in his belly was hitting him just right, everything just fuzzy enough to be fun without dulling his awareness too much. Thus, he picked up on it quickly as the murmur in the front room suddenly changed in volume and tone. This sound was excited and loud, and Okaren was tempted to peek out to see what all the fuss was about. Nah, too much work. Soon enough, though, the source of the hubbub stepped up into the back room, scowling at something behind him and telling a waitress who was dogging at his heels in a rumbling bass that he didn't want to be disturbed. Obediently, the army of gawking locals behind the dwarf and his strange companions was batted away, and the trio dropped into the table next to Okaren's. The leader let out a sigh of relief and leaned his head back against the wall behind him, and Okaren only had to catch a glimpse of the brand on the man's right cheek to guess who this was. Honestly, the stories had been every bit as much bull as he'd thought. Some noble, humbled warrior of a man this was. The fabled castless grey warden looked annoyed. Like a cook who'd found a nug in her larder. The human woman with the warden let herself into her seat more gracefully, and what a woman she was. She was dark and formidable, though Okaren would have been hard-pressed, in his current state, to say what exactly made her so dangerous-looking. Her lips were quirked in a reserved sort of amusement as she eyed her dwarven companion. The third companion was far taller than the human, and broader than the dwarf. A Cunary, Okaren realized, and one who didn't seem to be showing much expression at all. Sodding stone, the warden rumbled tiredly, his eyes still closed. I have never needed a drink this badly, and I once fell into a crevice for 2 days without any water. Oh, certainly it can't be so bad to be lauded as a hero, the woman said silkily, amused. For what? Kicking the crap out of a couple warriors? I don't remember everyone being so happy about it at the time. Okaren chuckled into his mug, remembering the fuss some time ago about the castless upstart who had trounced the best warriors on the proving grounds. Way to go, kid. The Cunary's head turned to stare at Okaren, and the dwarf raised his mug in toast to the large man. The Cunary turned away. 'Tis not the homecoming you expected, I take it. The woman said, leaning back in her seat. Oh, I expected the bowing and the hilariously ironic awe, and I wasn't disappointed about that. But by the stone did his royal pain in the ass ship choose a bad time to die. We have a blight to settle, and I'm stuck having to prove my loyalties to a pair of yes-men? I used to get paid to knock around guys like those ankle-biters. You'd think being a warden in the middle of a blight would at least grant me a sodding audience with one of the blighters who can do something about it. Okaren snorted a laugh. So that part of the rumors was true, then, the two contenders for the crown were fighting over the warden. Okaren didn't envy the guy, he'd had his fill of politics back when Branka had been rubbing elbows with everyone in the assembly. He couldn't imagine how much a headache being thrust into the middle of this mess would cause. A waitress came by with a tray, plunking another mug in front of Okaren, then setting the tray of 3 cups in front of the trio. The warden grabbed up one and downed it with a swig that gave Okaren a dose of respect for the guy. I used to stare up at the Diamond Quarter, you know, just wishing I could spend a single day there, the warden said wistfully after he'd set the empty mug back on the table. Now that I have, I can say that I miss Dust Town. The vermin there are much smaller, and they don't talk. Perhaps you could kill the both of them and take the crown yourself, the woman suggested with a sly smile. That would solve the impasse, one way or another. Yeah, right. Doesn't work that way, more's the pity. He rumbled a sigh, his voice going so low that Okaren had to lean over in his chair a bit to hear. I wonder if she could make a difference here. Sod it, I should have dragged her along, even if it meant weathering her glares the whole way. Why do you keep her secret, I wonder? And so very well that the rest of us do not suspect it until we stumble upon broken carvings of her. The woman arched a brow at him. Could it be that you truly never intended to tell it? The warden shrugged, but took a pull from a second mug instead of answering properly. For the first time, the Cunary spoke, his voice flat and businesslike. You said the paragon the Shaper spoke of might be able to end this quickly. Okaren nearly choked on his ale, suddenly feeling much more invested in the stranger's conversation. The beast of a man could only be talking about Branka. Maybe. The warden sighed, setting his mug back down. Paragons are like sodding gods here, Sten. The Shapers would have you believe they shit gold and live forever in the stone, or some claptrap like that. All she'd have to do is point a single finger, and this whole damn fuss would be done with. Problem is, she left Orzammer a couple years back and took her entire house with her. I don't remember why, only that it caused a lot of chaos among the upper castes, and that trickled down to the lower. The woman arched a brow. Good for business, I take it. Sodding right it was. Point is, unless we want to wander the deep roads, looking for someone who's most likely already dead, that idea's probably not going to amount to much other than wasting our time. The Cunary made a sound not unlike a growl. You, a Grey Warden, think fighting Darkspawn is a waste of time. No, I think fighting random Darkspawn is a waste of time, when I should be working toward getting that army to take out the Archdemon. There's no army to collect in the deep roads, unless you count the Legion of the Dead. The woman hummed. Then it seems we must suffer the machinations of these nobles until we have satisfied one of them enough to gain their audience. She paused. At such a time, my suggestion to simply kill one of them will likely resurface. Honestly, Morrigan, yeah. I'm keeping it on the table. The woman smiled her approval. I always did like you. The Grey Warden tilted his head back and drained the rest of the mug. From that point on, Okaren paid a great deal more attention to the rumors of what the Grey Warden was doing. 55 The cavalry arrives. Contrary to popular belief, sloth demons were not, in fact, particularly lazy. In fact, they were masters of deceit, more than willing to expound a great amount of effort to trap and ensnare their victims. They fed upon doubt and depression, wringing every last bit of willpower from their victims through means that were often insidious and frightfully effective. However, as far as demons went, they were not particularly spiteful. Felicity would even hazard to say that they were the most reasonable of the demonic archetypes, and sought to sustain themselves in a way that was efficient, rather than to seed destruction and chaos. It was with this in mind that Felicity, upon overhearing her companion's downfalls, had approached the demon. For this reason, she had been able to talk it out of immediately entrapping her, as her suggestion of ensuring that its feeding sources remained accessible seemed to intrigue it, although she suspected a certain long-acquired resistance to mental intrusion played a part in keeping her upright long enough to lay out her intentions. Thus, Felicity made a deal with the sloth demon. She would not interfere with its business and would ensure that all its current living victims remained alive for it to continue feeding on. In return, she would remain awake and in possession of all her faculties, so that she could best perform the task. It wasn't the first Fade creature she'd encountered face to face, and perhaps that was what allowed her to phrase her suggestion in the correct way. Even so, dealing with a demon raised all sorts of internal alarms. Was proximity alone enough to corrupt her soul? What if the creature asked more of her? How much of herself was she willing to sell, to save her companions? It was a quandary she'd only faced once before, when she was little more than a child playing with forces outside her understanding. Back then, that protective instinct had cost her freedom and family. This time, it may just cost her soul. For what must have been days, now, Felicity had stood above the bodies of her companions and Nile, keeping them watered and comfortable while they slept fitfully. She wished that she could merely shake them and awaken them, but she knew enough about this sort of magic to know that their spirits were elsewhere, and could not be drawn back until the demon released them. And so she could only bide her time, trying to calculate how long it would be until the rite of annulment arrived. It was a futile exercise, since she didn't know when it had been sent for, nor was there an easy way to tell the passing of the days from within the shuttered tower without the regular tolling of the meal bells. Still, it was better than worrying, about her friends, about Irving, about Cullen. No, far better she keep her mind occupied. Now, she surreptitiously checked over her shoulder to make sure that the demon was occupied. As usual, the creature was in its own world or, more likely, in the Fade. It rarely stirred and spoke to her, and only then to ask her curious questions about her friends in the manner of an alien spirit attempting to understand the mortal mind. Why did the priestess conceal its true nature? Why was the dwarf afraid of its sibling? Why did the old woman so easily accept a spirit, but so scorn demons? Felicity could answer none of these questions, though her mind keened with curiosity with each minor revelation. Satisfied that the demon was currently oblivious to the plane, she knelt beside Niall's sleeping form again. She had not known the older mage all that well back in the tower. He had been too brash for her sensibilities, though she'd never had any real quarrel with him. Still, his habit of acting too quickly had apparently worked to their advantage, because, the first day, Felicity had discovered something of interest on a parchment stuffed hastily in the mage's pocket. The Litany of Adralla was the sort of thing that Felicity had only read about. Had Niall not scrawled its name in the upper left-hand corner of the page, Felicity might have thought it merely a particularly fervent prayer. But, now that she'd had time to study it, she recognized the magic in the words, the symbolic power invested in the stanzas that bolstered the willpower. Combined with proper application of magic, it would be quite effective indeed against the mind control effects typical of blood mages. She had spent the last few days memorizing the words, making certain she got it exactly right, should she need it. Now, the litany was scorched into her mind, for the most part memorized in its entirety, however, for the most part, would not suffice. She needed to know this, like she had never known anything before. Something crashed outside the hall, and Felicity hastily hid the parchment back in Niall's pocket. She had seen a good share of abominations and blood mages milling about these last days. It was a state that had her constantly on edge, but the presence of the sloth demon seemed to warn them off from doing anything to her. She was under its protection, and that thought made her shudder in fear at the implications. Still, this was how it had to be. Otherwise, her companions would not have survived this long under the demon's magical sleep. Not physically, anyway, though she could not say anything about their mental states. There was another sound, a shout, and Felicity registered it as coming from through the hall's entrance door. Her heart started pounding as she recognized the voice. She glanced at the sloth demon, who hadn't stirred. Hurriedly, she stood and went to the door. She could hear them now, their heavy footsteps pounding through the corridors, getting closer. She slipped out the door and into the hall. As soon as she had shut the door behind her, she was tackled to the ground by a huge mulberry hound and promptly smothered in smelly dog tongue. Two armored figures pounded up behind Hugo, and Alistair barely stopped himself from beheading Felicity. His jaw went slack and his sword fell to the ground. "Felicity? You're all right." Percy, however, thrust out his shield to block Alistair from reaching out to her. Then, his sword swung down so that the tip was an inch from her eye in obvious threat. His eyes were hot, but his voice was cold. "What manner of abomination are you?" Felicity, despite the noble's hostility, couldn't quell her relief at seeing the two warriors. "I'm not one, though I don't blame you for thinking so. Honestly, Alistair, you're a Templar breaking into a tower held by demons and blood mages. Suspecting demonic possession should by all rights have been your first instinct, not his." Percy blinked and lowered his sword, and Alistair chuckled. "You are Felicity. How are you here, unhurt?" Percy asked, shooing Hugo off her. She gladly accepted their help in standing. "There's a sloth demon in the next room. It found me more useful awake than ensnared in the Fade with the others, and so here I've been, biding my time." "A sloth demon?" Alistair hissed, lowering his voice. "Did it hurt you? Has it tried to possess you?" Felicity shushed him, though she couldn't stamp down the warm feeling in her chest that his questions were out of concern for her. Percy's question, however, was not. "What do you mean, the others are ensnared in the Fade?" And so, quietly, and as succinctly as possible, Felicity told them about what had happened, and what manner of creature they were dealing with. "And if you walk in there," Felicity finished, "it will most likely merely pull you into the Fade as well." Percival made a low growling noise. "Then how can we hope to beat it?" Alistair, however, studied Felicity. He favored her with a knowing smirk. "You have a plan, don't you?" Felicity felt her face warm, though not unpleasantly so. Alistair had such faith in her, it seemed. "You didn't think that I spent the last days playing nursemaid without studying the way the magic works, now did you?" He chuckled. "You'd have to have studied something, or else you'd have gone mad." I have a very curious mind, she admitted with a smile, feeling lighter than she had in days as she looked up into those laughing eyes. Alistair was here, with his help, they could fix this. Percival cleared his throat, and whatever spell they'd been caught in broke as they recalled their situation. At least Alistair looked as discomfited by Percival's knowing expression as she was. So, what, exactly, is your plan? Well, the demon spends most of its time in the Fade, while keeping a manifestation here by feeding off the sleepers. Meanwhile, it feeds off the psychic energies of its victims in the Fade, likely all kept in its own realm. There is no guarantee that defeating its manifestation here will break its hold on the sleepers. However, if someone were to be pulled into the Fade, but stay in possession of their faculties, they could confront the demon there, breaking its hold on its victims. The demon will be banished and the sleepers will awaken unharmed. All of this assuming, of course, Percival said flatly, that we can resist the demon's spell in the first place. It is hardly simple, but I have deduced some means. I've discovered a litany spell that wards off mind control effects. Altering that into a ritual may protect someone from such things in such a subjective realm as the Fade, where willpower is so powerful. I had initially expected that I would be the one who had to go plunging in alone, but now that you are here. Felicity paused, realizing that this, in itself, was no mere boon. Why are you here? Should you not be in Redcliffe? The men exchanged a look. Alistair cleared his throat. They're having a couple demon problems themselves. Let's just say that, if your ritual requires lyrium, we should be sure to save some. They'll need it at Redcliffe. Felicity's heart fell at such news. It does. And that's awful news. Both men nodded solemnly, and Felicity made a mental note to ask them more about it later. Speaking of the lyrium, that's the main reason I haven't been able to do the ritual before now. It needs raw lyrium, which is kept in a cache in the storage tunnels. I don't have access to them while I must remain near the sloth demon, but as it is not yet aware of you two, you'll be free to go fetch it. Bring me about 5 pounds, and I'll be able to cast a ritual strong enough for all three of us. Percival and Alistair nodded their understanding. Where are the tunnels? Percy asked. The second floor. There's an entrance to a staircase there, though it's usually locked. She frowned, well aware that neither man owned a lockpick, much less knew how to use one. Then, Felicity snapped her fingers as realization dawned. The senior enchanters were provided with keys. Swiftly, she ducked back into the main room, once again checking to make sure that the sloth demon remained unaware of its surroundings. She skirted carefully around it, not wishing to startle it awake by approaching. When she reached the pallets where she'd laid out the others, she knelt next to Win and started digging through her former mentor's pockets. She winced as she did so, well imagining what sort of stern lecture the elder mage might have for her regarding proper respect of the privacy of the helpless. Then again, Win was a practical woman. Perhaps she would have approved of Felicity's actions during this whole ordeal, though that was very doubtful. Finally, her fingers closed over a keyring, and she slipped it into her own pocket and stood. As she started back toward the door, however, the demon's smooth, curling voice spoke. You grow restless, the sloth demon purred. Perhaps a bit of rest might do you some good. Felicity could feel the demon's tendrils seeping lethargically into her mind, but she wrapped her willpower around herself and resisted. The tendrils retreated. I am restless because I worry about my friends. You are not being cruel to them, I hope. Cruelty is such a strange concept. So nebulous. Undefined. I do not force them to stay as they are. I offer them places to do so, and they remain on their own. Is that your definition of cruelty, mortal? It sounded genuinely curious, honestly thoughtful. Felicity had to bite her tongue not to quibble. She had a deal to upkeep, at least for a little while longer. If their minds are their own, that is all I can ask. The sloth demon hummed thoughtfully. What a silly concept, their minds were mine as soon as they entered my realm. Just as yours could be, if you wish. And then its alertness retreated again. Felicity remained where she was for several minutes, just to make sure the demon was completely unaware of its surroundings. Then, carefully, she crossed to the door. Alistair and Percival were waiting for her on the other side, both pale. What do you suppose it's doing to them? Alistair whispered, eyes flickering toward the door into the corrupted chamber. Felicity shook her head and thrust the keyring into his hand. I don't want to think about it. Here. Get me 5 pounds of lyrium, and hurry. I'll prepare the ritual, we need to perform it as soon as possible. Agreed, Percy growled, his eyes narrow. We'll make that monster feel every minute of pain it might have inflicted on our allies. Felicity nodded, though something about Percy unnerved her when he spoke like that. Alistair seemed to sense it, for he laid a hand on her shoulder comfortingly. 5 pounds of lyrium coming right up. His sideways smile made her trepidation evaporate. You're lucky I'm not a full Templar, you know, or else I'd probably take all that lyrium for myself and run. In her relief, Felicity's chuckle sounded a bit too much like a giggle. As if you could abandon your fellow wardens, crippling addiction, or not. You'd probably thrust it into my hands regardless, right before you keeled over and went into a withdrawal seizure. Alistair's grin grew wide and warm, and something sparkled in his eyes. That is possibly the best way anyone has ever described my painful demise. His hand squeezed her shoulder again, and their eyes locked as sincerity thickened his voice. Thank you for saying that. Felicity only smiled, because there was nothing for him to be grateful for. When he smiled at her like that, she should be thanking him. It's only the truth. If you enjoy hearing it so much, perhaps I should describe your possible painful demises more often. His free hand reached up, and his thumb reached up to stroke her jawline, and her heart soared. His chuckle was gentle and soothing, warming her blood. His eyes sparkled, clear and warm, she couldn't seem to look away. You know, he said softly, I don't think I'd mind that. She tried to summon up some sort of teasing response, but her head seemed to be full of cotton. His hand on her shoulder was a supportive weight, a promise of a strong shield arm that she had certainly taken advantage of more than once. Meanwhile, the hand at her jaw was gentle, his thumb running idly along her skin with all the delicate care one would give to fine porcelain. It made her feel cherished, cared for, protected. It was something she hadn't felt since Cullen. Cullen, who had regarded her with much the same warmth as Alistair now did, and it suddenly seemed she was looking up into her former beau's eyes instead of her fellow wardens. Abruptly, she backed away, and she didn't miss the flash of confusion and hurt that crossed Alistair's face as she did so. I really am counting on you too, Felicity said quickly, turning to Percival so she didn't have to see that expression on Alistair's face. The nobleman's face was impassive. Be back as quickly as possible. There's no saying how long we have until the Templars invoke the right of annulment. Yes, the Knight Commander mentioned something about that, Percy said with a nod. We'll do our best not to let you become a splatter on the tower floor. The noble turned and started back toward the stairs down. Hugo. Alistair. Come. The dog immediately fell into step behind the nobleman, but the ex-Templar lingered, looking at her. Felicity, You've got nothing to apologize for, she said firmly. She dared to step up to him and pressed a hand to his cheek, marveling at the roughness of his stubble. We'll have plenty of time to speak later. For now, I think our minds should be focused on saving our companions, don't you agree? After a brief hesitation, he nodded. Later, then. Then, that smirk flitted across his features. It's a bit unnerving, you know, when you read me like a book. Well, you do leave yourself open for it. She stepped back, feeling better again. At least you're an interesting one. You're not half boring yourself, you know. He winked and turned to follow Percy, and Felicity was glad that he'd turned away, before her blush had completely consumed her to the tips of her ears. Alistair was sweet, but he would never have let her live it down. 56. The Fine Art of Suicide Missions. He'd intended to come to Lothering to find information. The rumors spreading across the countryside claimed that such was the place where his targets had last been seen, so it had seemed a promising place to start. A couple coins slipped under a table here or a wink offered in the right direction there, and the locals would surely tell him everything he needed to know about the target's numbers, skills, and, most important, destination. But alas, it seemed it was not meant to be. The dead tended to be quite uncooperative, even to those as skilled at interrogation as the Antivan Crows. Carolina scowled and stood, kicking the corpse she had been studying. He chuckled, and she turned a hard look on him. You find something amusing about this, elf? Ah, that word. Most seemed to think it an insult, but he found it refreshing to be reminded of that which had so often given him a distinct advantage. I was merely considering what such a display of temper does to your lovely boots, my dear. When yours are covered in gore, where will you find proper replacements in a country like Ferelden? What I do with my boots is none of your concern, elf. Ah, and yet my offer to help you remove them along with the rest of your clothing still stands, my dear Carolina. He winked lasciviously, if only to see her scoff. He did so enjoy provoking the hard-edged mage. She was often the most entertaining, and it wouldn't be long before they were both dead in the dirt anyway. Ah, but not today, it seemed. Today, he was doomed to lead his charges through this ghost town. Zevran glanced around, once again sighing at the empty houses and torn bodies that littered the streets. Old blood splattered the cobblestones and what remained of the citizens were well into the decay process, indicating that this place had been overrun quite some time ago. A week, at least. The lesser crows were currently split into small groups, scouring the village for survivors that could be questioned. But Zevran knew it was futile. Any survivors of this massacre would have fled long ago. Lothering was a dead end. Zevran couldn't resist chuckling at the thought. A dead end for dead men walking. Ah well, he could stand to wait a couple more days. As for the lesser crows who accompanied him, he could only assume that, as they were still following him now, they would not return to their senses in the next few days. Most of them were apprentices overeager to prove themselves, or newly promoted crows with unrealistic ideas as to their own abilities. Such idiocy from all of them, to sign up for this suicide mission under Zevran's lead. Not a single one would have made it as a crow. If anything, Zevran considered granting them all such swift ends a mercy. Carolina stomped through the ruins, Zevran following at a lazier pace behind her. He inhaled the scent of death and decay, feeling this a fitting place to end his illustrious career. Too bad the wardens he was hunting did not seem so eager to oblige his wishes. As if summoned by the thought, a pair of young assassins came running from the direction of the highway. Zevran had set these two to watch the road for travelers while the rest of them picked through the town. It seemed they'd found something. Either that, or they wanted in on the fun picking through the corpses themselves. Master Arena. One of them called, and Zevran couldn't suppress a chuckle at the honorific the newer assassins had given him during their travels. He was certainly quite a bit above any of their levels, but he was hardly a master. Master Arena. You won't believe this. They're coming right to us. Zevran felt a twist of anticipation, but didn't let his face betray any of it. Oh, and who is this? The wardens. The apprentice and the new assassin skidded to a stop in front of him, their eyes lit in anticipation of what they no doubt thought would be an easy fight. There are 3 of them walking right into the town now. Only 3? Zevran suppressed his disappointment, reminding himself that even a single warden should be enough to kill the entire squad of assassins. Assuming the legends were true, of course. Then let us see what all this fuss is about. He motioned for the pair to lead, and he fell into step behind them, the 3 assassins soon disappearing into the alleys of the ruined village. Zevran heard them before he saw them, as the crows were winding their way through the yards of what had once been humble abodes. Come by sooner. We might have been able to stop this. What, and face down the entire horde. Anyway, you were a bit preoccupied chasing your new tail, so I don't see how that could have happened. They spoke with one another, it seemed, completely heedless of the nest of assassins they had walked right into. Or perhaps the wardens did know, and did not care, knowing their skills would easily overpower the assassins? Ah, but Zevran was rarely so lucky. You're right, I guess. It doesn't make the sight any easier to bear, though. You forget, Lethalin, that these villagers had plenty of warning. They chose to stay here, rather than leaving to seek out safer lands. He motioned for the apprentice and rookie to stay out of sight, then approached the voices on his own, creeping through the yards until he reached a fence that overlooked the main road into town. There, he crouched, obscured by bushes and watching as the trio crested the hill leading in from the farmlands. Zevran was surprised to see that these fabled wardens who walked right into his snare were all elves. Not everyone is as easy to move as the Dalish, Mila, the one in the lead said, glancing over his shoulder at the woman. He was dressed in leathers, and Zevran's practiced eye caught the glint of wrist sheaths on both forearms. An interesting choice, that. The man also had a small lyre strapped to his back, the instrument unusual in its lopsidedness and the strange, vine-like carvings crawling up the sides. The other two, however, were the ones that truly caught Zevran's eye, and he could see how even these crow apprentices had recognized them. The guards who had survived their encounter with a group of escaped wardens some weeks back had been most descriptive, featuring heavily among the stories two elves that bore such facial tattoos. There was the elven woman with her red hair strung with beads and a bow strapped to her back. Zevran nodded to himself at that. The Dalish were notorious for their bowmanship, and rightfully so. He would have to warn Carolina to mind that one, as mages and archers rarely got along on opposing sides of the battlefield. The bedroom, of course, was another matter entirely, but such was the case for most things, Zevran had found. The guards' stories, however, had mentioned nothing about the large white wolf that followed at the archer's heels. He suspected if the wolf had been present at the time, it no doubt would have featured in the tale, just as the giant spider and vicious mulberry hound had. It was amusing, how unnerving some people found animals on the battlefield. Zevran would have to use it as a disarming tactic at some point. Then, he recalled that he wouldn't get any such chance. Alas, such was the way of things. The wolf's ears perked up, and it turned its head to growl straight at Zevran's hiding spot. The assassin could only arch his eyebrows, wondering if this would be his end here and now. Not again, the third warden groaned. Mila, can't you control that thing? He is a creature of his own mind, the woman said calmly. And a noble one at that. Would you ask a friend to be put on a leash? It's a friend now? By the fade. Finn, talk some sense into her. This isn't Hugo, this is a wild wolf. The man in front only shrugged and sent a tight smile over his shoulder. I don't know, Khazar. I rather like having Fang around. Oh you named it. Zevran stifled a chuckle as all three disregarded the wolf's growling and continued up the road. How silly for them to ignore an obvious omen, but perhaps he was in a particularly apt position to appreciate the irony. The third warden gave Zevran the most hope. An elven boy by his description had also featured prominently in the soldiers' retellings, a mage, supposedly. Zevran had previously seen robes like this one wore. They were made of hide and fur, which Zevran recognized from his brief sojourn with the Dalish as the typekeepers and their apprentices preferred. So he was dealing with two Dalish elves, was he? Strange, the boy did not act particularly Dalish, but Zevran was not one to quibble over details, if it meant he was as deadly as the Dalish reputation merited. Zevran dismissed the dual wielder as a non-threat, but the two Dalish elves would prove quite interesting. Perhaps they would provide the end he craved after all. And if not, well, there were still other wardens about. His end would come from one of them, certainly. He slipped away, nodding to the pair of fresh assassins that still waited on his signal. The three flitted off into the village, collecting the others and preparing for an ambush. Zevran found a suitable spot next to the ruined chantry, stacked with plenty of crates and broken walls for his companions to use as cover. Several of them set out leg-hold traps in the obvious choke points, but Zevran knew such things would prove little use against a skilled archer or a powerful mage. And if these elves were Grey Wardens, then it was safe to assume that they were skilled. Zevran made no attempt to hide, to the odd whispers of the 9 apprentices and fresh assassins around him. Zevran leaned against an abandoned merchant's cart, in full view of the road, and chuckled to himself. Yes, Zevran Arena was so skilled, so fearless, that he needed no concealment from even the fabled Grey Wardens. Or so they fancied, no doubt. Again, not a single one would have made it as an assassin, if they truly did not see the dagger poised right between their collective shoulder blades. Zevran was doing them, and the crows, a favor. When everything was ready, Carolina smirked and ran off, crying rather unconvincingly about the darkspawn that were attacking her. Any fool would have noticed that the corpses here were a week old, and that Carolina did not have a scratch on her, but such was the consequence of hiring one of the Crow's dimmer hedge mages for this task. Sure enough, Carolina returned a couple minutes later with 3 rather skeptical-looking wardens at her heels. Well, they, at least, weren't fools. Their eyes fell on him, and he chuckled as he watched all 3 immediately came to the right conclusions. Zevran reflected that he always did have a flair for the dramatic, even as he stepped forward and gave the signal. His fellows appeared from their hiding spots, bows drawn and blades at the ready. The 3 wardens were surrounded by 11 of the most well-trained murderers money could buy. If Zevran had been trying, it might have been a fair fight. With a grin, savoring the irony of the situation and anticipating the oncoming battle for more reasons than one, he drew his sword and raised it. The Grey Wardens die here. Bowstrings all around the clearing twanged, and all 3 wardens sprang into motion. The mage's fingers began dancing, and fire soon rained on one pocket of archers. And sure enough, as soon as Carolina revealed herself to be a mage with a lightning spell, the Dalish archer's arrows were set straight on her, even as the Dalish elf dove for cover against the assassins suppressing fire. The white wolf streaked across the road, nipping at the heels of the crow's melee fighters as they closed in on the mage. The warden mage seemed to be doing well enough at keeping them at bay, regularly casting a rather impressive series of lightning and fire blasts that kept the killers at a safe distance. Zevran dove into the chaos gleefully, his long sword and dagger becoming a whirl of death as he went straight for the mage. In such matters, it was always best to take the casters out quickly, and this mage appeared more dangerous than most, judging by the smoking ruins where half his archers had been a moment before. Oh yes, he wanted to die. But he certainly wasn't going to make it easy for them to bring it about. As he was lining up for the killing blow behind the mage's oblivious back, his dagger was intercepted by another's. Startled, he dodged back in time to avoid the second dagger arcing in toward his neck, and he turned to see the dual wielder, crouched in an easy battle stance, smirking at him as if teasing him for failing to stab his friend. So this dagger fighter wanted to play, then? Zevran was hardly one to turn down such a challenge. Zevran turned his full attention to the dual wielder, stabbing his sword in to end it quickly with a killing blow, but his blade was easily knocked aside and rejoined with a stab at his side. He parried the blade gracefully, but the second dagger swooped in quickly enough to throw him back on his heels, lest he mar his perfectly marketable face. The dagger wielder pressed the advantage as well as any crow, and only Zevran getting behind the other elf allowed him to gain equal ground again. The other elf spun agilely to meet him, blocking his double thrust with a two-handed parry, and Zevran nearly laughed as the elf's foot came forward to kick at a rather impolite area. Zevran slid back out of harm's way as soon as he saw the other elf's weight shift. So this elf knew how to fight dirty, did he? How often had the assassin used that very same maneuver himself? It was particularly effective, he'd found, when his opponent wasn't wearing any clothes. Now completely engrossed at their deadly, whirling dance, Zevran's awareness of the rest of the fight faded. How silly he'd been, to discount the dual wielder as a non-threat. This was the most challenge he'd had in months. He dodged the whirling daggers and ducked behind the broken merchant's cart, hoping to catch his target as he came around. However, the elf didn't follow Zevran around the side as expected. The Antivan looked around for the other elf, perplexed, and then yelped as the elf came down from above, having climbed over the cart. Zev rolled away before he could be pinned down, but not before taking a slice to the shoulder for it. It was one of many such wounds he already bore from those glinting daggers, and it was all Zevran could do not to laugh with elation. Yes, this was exactly what he wanted, to die in a battle as one befitting his skills. The secret poet in him crowed in triumph, even as he again threw himself on those whirling daggers, his own blades blurring as metal rang on metal again and again. At some point as they spun and ducked around one another, their eyes locked, both sparkling with primal enjoyment. Zevran could see the wonder in the other's eyes, that of one just discovering the beauty of the deadly dance, not unlike the discovery of sex, really. Zevran was almost disappointed that he would not be able to enjoy that discovery with future duels. Alas, they were trying to kill one another, and that did put a damper on future relations. So engrossed in the fight was he that he didn't notice as, one by one, his assassins were consumed by a torrent of fire. He didn't hear Carolina's screams as a white wolf tore into her throat. He did not register that the only sound left in the abandoned village was the rapid ring of steel on steel as the pair traded blows again and again. And then Zevran sprinted back around the cart, turned to anticipate the dual wielder's little jumping move, and came face to face with a small, irritated mage. The mage lifted a hand, and the sting of lightning enveloped Zevran. The world flickered out, and Zevran thought that this was it, and that he was not nearly as happy about that as he should be. His senses returned slowly, first and foremost accompanied by the tingling ache of the newly electrocuted one of many sensations he was familiar with, courtesy of the thoroughness of crow training. He wondered if this was what it was like to be dead, but quickly discarded the idea. There were many different beliefs about what happened after one kicked the bucket, but Zevran suspected eating dirt was not one of them. He opened his eyes and lifted his face from the mud, rather surprised to see just who was crouching over him. His mind swiftly assessed the situation. His arms were tied behind his back, and the woman had a knife held threateningly in front of him. They'd kept him alive? Why? An answer presented itself easily enough. They obviously wished to interrogate him before they killed him. A bad time to lose his nerve, it seemed, but there it was. He couldn't deny the wave of relief that washed through him at realizing that his end had not yet come. He didn't want to die. He wanted to live? Yes, it seemed it was so. It seemed this would have been far more convenient to have discovered sooner, but Zevran was never one to dwell upon lost opportunities. He was more skilled at making new ones. The woman and dual wielder were both crouching over him, the first with a hunting knife trained on him and suspicion in her eyes. The second, however, looked more curious than hostile, a strange expression, given Zevran had just spent the last 5 minutes trying to kill him. Behind them stood the mage, arms crossed and scowling. The wolf could be seen in the background, making a hearty meal of the fresh corpses. Ah! Yes, not a single other crow was left alive, it seemed. That was, admittedly, rather impressive. Zevran attempted to sit up to meet his captors with a bit of dignity, but that only woke up all the stings of his battle wounds, on top of the ache of electrocution. For all his years of training, he couldn't suppress a groan. I rather thought I'd wake up dead, or not wake up at all, as the case may be. The mage grumbled something, but it was the dual wielder who engaged him. We have some questions, and corpses can be stodgy about answering. Zevran couldn't help but smile, since he'd made a very similar observation not that long ago. And wouldn't you know it, the dual wielder's lips quirked in response. Ah, so I am to be interrogated, then. Zevran knew this technique. He'd seen it employed many times, and had occasionally been roped into it himself. One interrogator makes himself look menacing and ready to kill at a moment's notice, while the other smiles and pretends to be the victim's friend, so the victim feels like they can trust that person. Usually, Zevran was cast as the friendly one, likely due to his race and amazingly good looks. Just once, he would have liked to be the intimidating one. Ah, but that was neither here, nor there. Still, from this angle, bound and helpless on the ground, he could see why it worked. Let me save you some time. My name is Zevran Zev to my friends, and I am a member of the Antivan Crows, brought here for the sole purpose of slaying any surviving Grey Wardens. Which I have failed at, sadly. Obviously, the mage said snidely, but the rogue waved him to quiet. What are the Antivan Crows? He asked, and Zevran was actually a little insulted by the question. Could they really not know? No, the dual wielder was exchanging curious looks with his two companions. They'd never heard of the Crows. That must be rectified, if only as a matter of professional pride. We are an order of assassins based in Antiva. We pride ourselves in getting the job done, given the right price, that is. I'm surprised you haven't heard of the Crows. Where I come from, we're rather infamous. Not for being good assassins, apparently, the mage snapped. Zevran forced a weak laugh. Yes, I can see how you might get that impression. Rest assured, for one to fail like this is quite rare. It's rather frowned upon among the Crows, you see, to get paid to kill a mark, and then not kill him. Who paid you? The dual wielder asked. Me personally? The Crows. But as to who paid the Crows, it was a rather taciturn fellow in the capital. Loghain, I think his name was. The mage spat a rather blasphemous curse. The answer sparked an interesting light in the dual wielder's eyes, and Zevran definitely detected the gleam of a plot being spun. Ah, so the mage and the archer were the muscle here, it was apparent that the brains of this operation was the rogue. After a moment of thought, the rogue asked smoothly, "When were you to see him next?" Ha, as if Zevran could not guess what the schemer was planning. Pity, he'd have to spoil such a poetically delightful plan. I wasn't. If I had succeeded in killing all of you, I would have returned home, and the crows would have informed your Loghain of the results. If I had failed, I would be dead. Or I should be, at least, as far as the crows are concerned. He lifted a shoulder in a shrug. No need to see Loghain, then. The rogue let out an appreciative snort of laughter. Zevran cursed silently as he was taken in by it. He knew it was a mask for the matter of interrogation, but it was an effective one. Even he, a crow trained to withstand such techniques, was warming to the rogue. It didn't help that all three elves were quite attractive. Alas, it was as if the powers that be had designed this trap with Zevran's specific weaknesses in mind. Are you particularly loyal to Loghain, then? Ah, but that was an awkward question to ask a crow. I have no idea what his issues are with you. The usual, I imagine. You threaten his power, yes. All three nodded, as if there was any doubt. Beyond that, no. I'm not loyal to him. I was contracted to perform a service. Should you wish to return the favor, you would have to take it up with my superiors. He paused, and amended, or would have, anyway, were I not now as good as dead in their eyes. Something glinted in the rogue's eyes. And sparing your life would not be fair payment for seeing such a job done. What? The mage squawked. Finian, he tried to murder us. You said we'd wake him up for questioning, not take him on as another pet. The woman leveled a hard look up at the mage. I hope you are not referring to Fang as a pet, Delethalin. The mage threw his hands in the air. You too? Wonderful, we named it. Now we have to keep it. Zevran allowed himself a chuckle, and turned his attention back to his interrogator. He startled when he realized that the rogue hadn't taken his eyes off Zevran. The assassin could feel the assessment in the other elf's gaze. Definitely the brains, yes. And it seemed the rogue was still awaiting his answer to that rather possibility-laden question. Zevran had expected to be killed as soon as the wardens were out of questions, but it seemed this Finian had other plans. The assassin pondered the question. In the crows, he said carefully, it is rather bad for business for one to stab the hand holding the purse strings, if you take my meaning. However, dead men do tend to have minds of their own, yes? What with being uncooperative in interrogations and the like. Zevran was surprised by how easily the other elf caught his meaning. A sly smirk stole across Finian's face. You seem to be doing well enough at that, though. Ahaha, yes, I suppose I am. I do aim to please, in whatever way befits the situation. Finn, the mage spoke up again. You can't be serious, here. This guy's an assassin. What's to say he won't turn around and stab us in the back as soon as we untie him? The rogue sent a grin over his shoulder. And you'd let him? I'd expect you to turn him into a husk of charred meat if he even implied it in jest, much less made an actual attempt. The mage wrinkled his nose, mollified, but made no move to deny it. Zevran arched an eyebrow, making note not to provoke the mage unnecessarily, even if the boy's obvious temper looked like it would be great fun to rile. In this, the woman said, I agree with Khazar. This man is dangerous. And that's why we can use him, Finian said. He turned to arch a brow at the assassin. Right, Zevran. In whatever way you see fit, he replied easily, masking his nervousness from having his continued state of existence be voted down. I am quite good at a number of things: stealth, lock-picking, poisons, making people die, and I assure you, I have other talents that, should they be necessary, would also be at your disposal. And that could be used against the wardens, if Zevran felt so inclined to finish his contract after all. You must think we're royally stupid. The mage, Khazar, snapped, as if reading his mind. No, I think you're royally tough to kill. I'm only hoping you're royally stupid. The woman tensed, her knife coming a couple inches closer to Zevran's throat, and Zevran quickly backpedaled, realizing that Finian was the only one he should be joking with at the moment. Let me rephrase that. He met the rogue's eyes, because he wasn't making any ground with the other two, and it was obvious who the one in charge was anyway. I'm hoping that you're the sort of fellow that takes a chance every now and again. Ha ha, no. The rogue let him stew on his nerves for a bit, the bastard. Again, Zevran felt the piercing nature of the elf's gaze, even if a smirk did quirk the rogue's lips, and the assassin wondered whether the rogue had spotted his rather unloyal thoughts a moment ago. If so, he was as good as dead, and he did not want such an end anymore. Not like this, anyway. One last question, Zevran of the Antivan Crows. The assassin swallowed at the low, silky tone in the rogue's voice. Is your loyalty worth your life? It was a threat, even if it was delivered in a soft, seemingly friendly tone, and Zevran wondered just what sort of creature this particular warden was. The other two were straightforward enough to the point of boredom, in the case of the woman, but this elf was dangerous in the way that the smoothest of crow masters was dangerous. All soft words and silver tongues, until you died of a poison you hadn't even been aware of drinking. He licked his lips, trying to come up with a way to get this man to put some trust in him. At least until he could properly sort this out. I happen to be a very loyal person, up until the point where someone expects me to die for failing. That's not a fault, really. The rogue didn't react one way or another. It was disconcerting. But as I said, the crows do not take kindly to such things as failure. The severance package is garbage, let me tell you. I failed to kill you, so my life is forfeit. That's how it works. If you don't kill me, the crows will. Even if I finish the job later, they would be just as likely to kill me on principle for failing the first time. That, at least, made the rogue nod thoughtfully. Thing is, I like living. Surprisingly. And you are obviously the sort of people to give the crows pause. It is in my best interest to serve you, yes. He heard the mage growl, you can't seriously believe this, but he didn't take his gaze off the rogue's big brown eyes. This Finian was obviously the one to convince. Zevran suspected that, if he could be won over, a clever, scheming sort of man like this would be able to persuade any dissenters from cutting Zevran's throat. At least until the assassin had a chance to decide whether he intended to do the same to them. So you'll be using us as protection, Finian said slowly. You're expecting them to come after you. No point denying it. Possibly. I happen to know their wily ways, however. I can protect myself, as well as you. He glanced around at the assassin corpses that littered the ground. Not that you seem to need much help in that department. That we don't. Again, it was a threat, delivered with a smile. Even so, Finian nodded to the woman, and the Dalish elf bent over him with the knife. For a moment, Zevran worried that they had decided to kill him after all. Instead, the Dalish elf reached behind him, and, a couple seconds later, Zevran felt the ropes around his wrist lose their tautness. He pulled his hands forward and rubbed his wrists. He was startled to see that his bindings hadn't been ropes, but vines. The doing of the mage, perhaps? Both elves crouching over him stood, and the rogue offered a hand to help Zevran up. The assassin took it, all too aware of the deadly dagger stored inches from where his hand gripped, ready to pop out and stab him in the heart should he reveal any ill intent toward the wardens. We accept your service, then, assassin, the rogue said, pulling Zevran to his feet. Your life for your loyalty. Zevran flourished a bow. So it is then that I hereby pledge my oath of loyalty to you, he said, catching and holding Finian's gaze, until such a time as you choose to release me from it. I am your man, without reservation. This I swear. An amused smile quirked the rogue's lips. Now that, I didn't expect. And with that, the tension hanging in the air dropped, though Zevran had difficulty placing just what kind of tension it was. So, my exalted and most merciful master, what would be your bidding? For now? Kill Darkspawn with us. Ah, a fine use of the legendary subtlety and finesse of the Antivan Crows. Finian smirked and started leading them away from the scene of the carnage. The other two elven wardens fell in step behind them. Do I detect a hint of sarcasm there, assassin? Braska, but the rogue's grin was infectious, now that the threat of imminent death seemed to have passed. Why, I would never think to speak so disrespectfully to one of the fabled Grey Wardens. Especially not one who has no reservations about jumping over carts to stab hapless assassins. Finian laughed, and Zevran took that as a good sign. Yes, getting into this one's good graces was his best bet at surviving this new development, especially given the glares the other two were leveling at his back. This is just wonderful, the mage's voice grumbled behind them. First the wolf, and now an assassin? You know what? I want a dangerous pet that will one day turn around and kill me. Maybe a Sylvan. Or a rage demon. Can you talk a rage demon into joining us, too, Finn? We need every able sword we can get against the darkspawn, his rogue said in entirely reasonable tones. Silver-tongued rascal. And think of it this way, should Loghain's regency become a thorn in our sides down the road, well, let's just say having a trained assassin on our side may make things a lot smoother. Zevran arched a brow at that, even as the mage grumbled quietly to himself, seemingly mollified. He never would have expected a Grey Warden heroic saviors of Thedas and all that to be so shrewd. Ah well. It would certainly make things more interesting, at the least. Until he decided whether or not he was going to kill them all, of course. 57 The Prince of Snakes. They got a couple stares as they wove their way back through Orzammer. Garrote supposed the citizens had their right to stare, since the trio was absolutely covered in darkspawn blood. Still, he couldn't help but chuckle. Most of the poor sods had probably never seen a darkspawn in their lives. He hadn't before Ostagar. And look at him now, covered in the creature's gore, with a recommendation from Lord Dace tucked firmly in his pocket. Sure, the materials used to convince the Deshers were likely forged or at least stolen, but that was right up Garrote's alley. Lord Harrowmont could shove his proving. He'd already gone through that once, and he had no intention of risking his neck like that again. Prince Belen was more Garrote's style anyway, if the blatant blackmail was anything to go by. Garrote just wouldn't let himself become a lackey again. I must say I like this deadly Grey Warden walk you've got, Morrigan's voice said silkily behind him. Feeling particularly formidable today, Warden. Wouldn't you be? Garrote shot back with a smirk. I'm a darkspawn killing machine. Maybe once the assembly sees how much blood I'm coated with, they'll buckle down and give me my sodding army, king, or not. Yes, and perhaps my mother will keel over and die in the next couple days. Never hurts to be optimistic. He arched a brow back at her, and she laughed. That, at least, seemed to be a genuine one. He had Morrigan pegged, now, after so long traveling with just her and the Cunary. She was manipulative, yes, but only to certain ends. He hadn't quite figured out what those ends were, but it seemed to have something to do with ingratiating herself with the Wardens. She'd had Percival panting after her back in Lothering, and gotten a couple bites from him, judging by those new marks on her bare skin when they'd left the village, and now she seemed to think that seducing Garrote was a viable course of action. He had to admit that she was a damn fine woman, especially for a human, and he doubted that she was one to get emotionally attached after a tumble. However, Garrote didn't trust a person whose motives he didn't understand. Until he knew what the witch was getting out of it, he didn't trust her enough to be alone and naked with her. Sten followed behind Morrigan, his face impassive as he scanned the crowd with an eye attentive for trouble. Garrote could not believe how glad he was that he'd saved the Cunary. The man was a strong, steady sword, willing to wade right into a fight with his blade swinging, leaving Garrote the chance to sneak in and pick around the edges. The dwarves only wished their warriors were so brave. No wonder the Cunary were so damned good at taking over Thedas. Still, there were things about Sten that Garrote found perplexing. He'd tried to pay the Cunary once, as a good boss should pay any of his hired swords. The Cunary had refused to take the purse, and, obviously insulted, had said something along the lines of, "You would not reward a spider for spinning a web." Garrote could only shake his head in confusion and make a note not to try that again. Vartag Gavorn had said to meet him in the palace once all the applicable votes had been secured, so that's where Garrote was headed. By now, the auspicious glamour of the Diamond Quarter no longer impressed him, due mostly to the conduct of its residents. At least when dusters had quarrels, they settled it by honorably trying to kill one another. None of this whispering behind other people's backs and blackmailing and bribing their way to the top. Then again, Garrote supposed if the castes weren't prone to such things, he never would have gotten his job in the Carta, and then where would he be? Begging for scraps, that's where. Garrot tossed the palace doors wide as he entered, and every guard in the place turned to watch him cross the entrance hall. The nobles and servants alike started whispering among themselves as he stepped inside. He smirked at the lot of them, well aware of the eyes that were trained on his face brand. How it must stew them, to see casteless trash elevated to the illustrious Grey Wardens. Walking around in areas that had been denied him before never got old, if only because it so obviously steamed those who felt entitled to his exclusion. Garrot stopped expectantly in the middle of the hall. There were 3 doors off the chamber, and Gavorn had not seen fit to offer him further instructions other than, report to the royal palace when you're done. What is your business here, Grey Warden? One of the guards said, stepping forward to meet him. Garrot crossed his arms casually, still smirking. The guards were glaring at the weapons hanging off his belt, and he had no intention of removing them. Is that any way to address your prince's champion? Then again, I suppose delivering a couple papers isn't exactly the height of heroism. Where's Vartag Gavorn? He here. The guard nodded behind him, and another guard went running through a doorway, hopefully to fetch the prince's yes man. We will let him know you came by, the guard said, turning back to him. In the meantime, honored warden, please wait outside. You're dirtying the entrance hall. Garrot barked a laugh. Oh, am I? And do you mean my current coat of darkspawn blood when you say that? He laced his next words with menace. Or are you just maybe talking about something else? The guard paled. I would never presume to. We are honored to have a Grey Warden in our midst. Yeah? Funny how that works, isn't it? I was born less than a person, not even worth the effort of putting me out of my misery, and now I come back a Grey Warden and it's suddenly an honor to know me. Guess we dwarves are charming, like that. The guard looked utterly flustered, probably trying to reconcile the casteless Grey Warden dichotomy. However, he was saved from trying to scrounge up an answer by the door on the left opening. The head that peeked out at him wasn't Gavorn's, and Garrot was genuinely dumbfounded at seeing this particular face in the palace, of all places. You're back! Rika cried, bursting out of the doors and running over to him. His sister tackled him in a hug, burying her face in his filthy leathers. Garrot! It's so good to see you! It was all he could do to stand there and blink, the usually smooth-running cogs in his head stuttering over this shock. He hadn't had the heart to set foot in Dust Town yet. He'd fought and scraped his way out of that rat hole, and had no intention of ever going back. As such, he hadn't had a chance to meet his family and old friends. He'd kind of hoped they'd crawl out of the tunnels when they heard of his presence in Orzammar, and he admitted he'd been disappointed when he'd passed a couple days without word. Still, he'd had more important things to do than dwell on missed happy reunions, so he'd shrugged and gotten on with his job. And just who is this? Morrigan asked silkily, though there was an underlying hostility in her voice. An old flame, perhaps. What? Rika drew back to look at the witch. Then, she laughed, and Garrot marveled that he'd never seen his sister so happy. No, nothing like that. I'm Rika, Garrot's sister. And you are? Charmed, I'm sure. The sarcasm in the witch's voice was thick enough to spread on bread. Morrigan, act civilized for a couple minutes, Garrot said, finding his wits. Rika, what are you doing here? You don't know. His sister peered up at him in surprise. No, I don't suppose you would you? I'm. Her grin was bright, once again so very unlike the downtrodden sister he was used to. I'm Prince Belen's consort. Oh, how convenient indeed, Morrigan's voice cooed. If one must sell oneself, one couldn't have picked a better buyer than Dash. Her words were cut off by Garrot's hand axe flying at her. She apparently anticipated the weapon, and the axe passed harmlessly through the cloud of flies she immediately shapeshifted into. The axe embedded itself in the wall behind her with a clunk, and several guards around the room looked uncertain over whether to apprehend the warden or not. As the Morrigan swarm reformed into her usual shapely figure, Garrot scowled at her. I usually don't mind your snide remarks, but my sister is off limits. Got that? Or else I'm gonna have to bring up a certain nobleman you ain't exactly been chased with yourself. If you thought I was being sarcastic, the witch said stiffly, then that is your own failing, not mine. I, for one, applaud such ambition, particularly if casteless life is as unbearable as you have often implied. I say bravo to her for managing to claw her way out of such a dreary existence. Sten, however, frowned at that. So the woman seeks to change her own station by attaching herself to one of the leaders. This is strange. What does he get out of this? Garrot stiffened, but Rika smiled shyly at the question, silencing any response. She smiled up at him, her hand going to her belly. Which Garrot realized, was a bit rounder than it had been when he'd left. And not merely from plentiful food. His eyes widened. You're. She nodded. Belen says he doesn't care, even if it's a girl, he won't turn me away. He's a good man, brother. It means so much to me to see you supporting him. As it does to us all, said a new voice, and Garrot looked up to see the man himself, leaning in the doorway through which Rika had come. At least, Garrot could only assume this was Prince Belen. He looked enough like Marnan, though his hair was a shade lighter, closer to strawberry blonde than Marnan's Spitfire red. His eyes had the same confidence she did, though, as well as a certain amount of craftiness that Marnan did not. Not for the first time, Garrot wondered what the truth behind Marnan's exile truly was. You must be the honorable and suspiciously well-positioned prince, Garrot chuckled, not bothering to bow. Belen nodded with a good-natured smile, though his eyes watched Garrot with the cunning intensity of a cat on a mouse. That I am. It is good to meet you at last, Garrot Broska. To say that I've heard a lot about you is an understatement. I admit, the stories do not disappoint. Yep, this was a silver-tongued adder, if he'd ever met one. He snorted. You'll find flattery doesn't work on me, your princeliness. At this, the prince smirked and inclined his head. I did not say that all the stories were flattering. At that, Garrot laughed in earnest, and finally gave the prince a bow, though it was one of a man bested in a verbal sparring match, rather than that of a commoner to a prince. The prince nodded his own acknowledgement. When you've caught up with your sister, Warden, please, meet me in my chambers. We've matters of the throne to discuss, I believe. That we do. The prince left back through the doors, and Rika immediately swatted his arm. Ow. What? I can't believe you talked to Belen like that. She laughed. I was used to it with Birat, but not with a prince. By the ancestors, Garrot, if he didn't have the sense of humor he does. He'd be down one of his most influential supporters, wouldn't he? Garrot said with a smirk. Don't worry, Rika. Belen's not the kind of man to let an opportunity slip by him, even if that opportunity gives him a little lip. Rika shook her head in exasperation, still smiling fondly. You haven't changed a bit, have you? I guess I should be glad. When you left to join the Wardens, I was worried you'd come back as some grim, straight-laced figure from out of an old tale or something. Garrot wrapped an arm around his sister again. Never fear, Rika. I will always be the same irreverent thug you know and love. I just happen to have added kicking archdemons in the balls to my job description. I still can't believe it, you know. My little brother, a Grey Warden. Says the sister who is carrying the child of a sodding prince. Oh Stone, this would make him and Marnan in-laws. Seems we Briskas are moving up in the world, eh? What must Ma think? Rika caught the question that he would never be able to ask out loud. She's okay, Garrot. Belen's providing for her, and for me, and she's doing a lot better these days. She misses you, though. He grunted, looking away. Come on. You shouldn't leave Belen waiting. She started back through the door, and Garrot followed. Morrigan and Sten walked behind. When the guards blocked them from following the dwarves into the residences, Sten looked about ready to start adding notches to his great sword. It's okay, Garrot said to his companions. I'll go on alone. You guys wait for me, I won't be long. I will not be left out, Morrigan fumed. Garrot arched an eyebrow at her. If the prince wants to see me alone, then I guess I get to be the only one he'll see. He could tell by the flash of understanding in her eyes that she took his meaning, and he turned and left the pair to their own devices. Rika led him through the corridors silently. She was nervous, he realized. But was she worried for Belen or for Garat? After a couple minutes, they turned to a set of double doors and Rika knocked. "Let him in," came that smooth voice from inside, and Garat stepped through the double doors into a chamber bigger than 4 or 5 houses in Dust Town. Belen sat at a desk off to one side, and nodded a greeting. "Thank you, Rika. If you don't mind, I'd like to speak with him alone." "Of course, my lord," Rika said with a bow, and disappeared with the soft click of the door shutting. Garat was left standing alone in the middle of the adder's nest, being studied by the king of snakes himself. It was surprising how nervous he suddenly was. Belen was an opportunist, and Garat knew from personal experience just how little such kinds could be trusted. "Let's not mince words, Warden," Belen said at last, the charismatic smile dropping from his face as he leaned back in his chair. Now, the prince was all cold calculation, and that was a change that Garat found himself appreciating. "You're an intelligent man, that much is clear, and not above getting your hands dirty. I can appreciate that. But if you ever dare to come out and accuse me of what you just implied in the entrance hall, I will have you killed. Do not doubt that." Garat nodded, feeling much more comfortable with this Belen than the smiling, laughing one from 5 minutes before. "Heh. Don't worry, I don't volunteer information. Not unless the price for blabbing is higher than the cost, and since you've got my sister in your pocket, the cost is more than I'd ever be willing to pay." Belen's eyes narrowed. "If you're implying that I'd ever hurt Rika dash. Why wouldn't you?" Garat let one hand fall to his dagger, lamenting the fact that his hand axe was still stuck in the entrance hall wall. "She's a casteless concubine. Last I heard, you nobles don't exactly get invested in those unless there's a little bundle involved. You don't even know if it's male, so what's she to you?" Belen stood up, obviously beginning to lose his temper. Garat found it encouraging that this would get him so worked up. "You'd speak of your sister that way?" Garat laughed humorlessly. "You're one to talk, considering what you did to your own." At that, both of them froze. Belen's eyes went wide as he studied Garat, and the warden cursed inwardly at the slip. Too late to recall it now. The prince's lips quirked in a sly smile, and Garat could practically see him putting the pieces together. "You were still in the deep roads, weren't you? You and the wardens? Harrowmont, that scheming son of a nug. He'd spoken with the commander about his projected route, he would have sent her straight to you." Garat forced a smile, though he felt like he'd just lost a major bargaining chip. More, he felt like he'd somehow betrayed Marnan. What was that about? What did he care? Imagine if she came back and testified against you. I bet her accusations would carry a bit more weight than mine, since she obviously knows what went down firsthand. Belen sat back again, eyes hooded. "And you would allow her to do this, knowing that, if Harrowmont won, it would send your sister back to Dust Town. She can find another noble. There's only one throne." Belen was silent for a minute, obviously turning that over in his mind. Garat kept his gaze steady and confident, unsure whether this all was a bluff or not. The only sound for a long moment was that of a nug, scrabbling quietly in a corner of the room. Then, the prince asked, "What, exactly, are your demands here?" "Just this, if I make you king, you treat my sister with the respect a girl like her deserves, whether that kid is a son or daughter." "A non-issue." Belen waved a hand dismissively. "I have no intention of turning her away. If the child is a girl, then the Deshers will just have to hold their tongues until we can present them with a son. Of that, you have my word." It was Garat's turn to study the prince, and Belen met his eyes steadily. Garat couldn't detect any lie in that assurance, and he prided himself in being pretty good at detecting bullshit. Satisfied, he nodded. "Then I guess we both got a good reason to get along, don't we?" Belen's smile was slow and sly, and a little respectful. "That we do." "Well played, Warden." Garat bowed again, smirking. "So, my prince. What's the next step in making you king?" The prince's smirk widened. "Oh, this is one you'll appreciate, I think. Rika did say you have a strong sense of irony." Garat arched a brow. Belen stood up. "Orzammer has some problems. Ones that I'd like to see solved, and intend to do so should I receive the crown." Garrot smirked. Unfold. And so, I need to send a message to the assembly, to make my intentions clear. At the same time, it will be cleaning up a deep stalker nest that has been festering in this city for far too long, ruining lives and leeching off what little economy we can maintain. Garrot laughed, because he did, indeed, have a strong sense of irony. You're talking about the Carta. That I am. Belen smiled at him, a gleam in his eyes. What do you say, Warden? Would you like to take back Dust Town, for all the branded boys who have to sign on as a thug or get their heads knocked in, and for all the casteless girls who have to spread their legs to have any hope of anything better? Garrot laughed heartily. For them? No. This, I'll be doing for me. You got yourself a deal. Boss. The prince held out his hand, and sought it if Garrot didn't shake it. As he left the room and worked his way back to the entrance hall alone, a nug crawled out of a hole in the wall and climbed up onto his shoulder. Once perched, it chittered something that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. Not a word, Morrigan, Garrot said with a snort. Some people would pay for the sort of entertainment you just witnessed. Now, let's find our cunnery. We've got some heads to bash in. 58 what might have been. They didn't find 5 pounds of lyrium. As it turned out, the storage tunnels had been completely overtaken by abominations. This was to be expected, Alistair supposed, because one couldn't have a proper quest without slaying a dozen monsters on the way. They only managed to get part of the way in before they had to call it a loss and head back. Still, Felicity took what little lyrium they had scrounged up with pursed lips, and Alistair felt a bit like he was back at the chantry, forgetting parts of the chant again. This is enough for one of us, she said, her gaze flicking between the two of them. You should be the one, Alistair said. Since you actually know what you're doing. She smiled bashfully, and he stifled the urge to reach out and touch her. He was having the strangest impulses lately. He'd already given in to that one once, no need for an encore. No, it is probably best if I remain outside, so I can continue to sustain your material bodies. She looked up at him. It should be you, Alistair. Your Templar training already gives you a natural mental resistance to demonic control, the ritual will be able to build upon that. Alistair glanced over at Percival, who nodded. I agree. When it comes to demons, I do not have the best defenses. There was bitterness in his comrade's tone, and Alistair thought it best not to ask. They were huddled in a side room off the main chamber, Hugo occasionally growling in the direction of the door. Felicity took the lyrium and dipped a broken quill pen inside. Then, using it like a brush, she started drawing fancy designs on the floor, and an old, chantry-trained part of him started to spike in nervousness. So, this isn't going to hurt, is it? Or turn me into anything, Wardy? Felicity smiled teasingly. You still think being turned into a frog is the worst thing a mage can do to you? After this. Alistair shrugged, but returned the smile. Not the worst, no. But that doesn't exactly make it pleasant, now does it? Her soft laugh was musical, and Alistair again wanted to reach out and touch her. He seemed to be a bit muddled lately. She gestured for him to stand on top of one of the runes. Obediently, he did so, even offering her a mocking salute. He was rewarded with another chuckle. Then, Felicity stood on another rune she'd drawn and started chanting something. Alistair bit down a spike of anxiety as he felt magic begin swirling around the both of them. Everything in his Templar training told him to disrupt the spell, but he suspected Felicity would be a mite miffed if he did so. That Templar voice became 10 times stronger as he felt the magic seep into his mind. Calm, he reminded himself. You know this. Discipline. Mental fortitude. He closed his eyes and sought the old meditations, even as the magic wrapped gently around his mind. It didn't intrude, as he'd worried it might, but rather wrapped around his mind like a shield. It almost tingled, actually. From somewhere far away, above the magic and the sound of Felicity chanting, Alistair heard Hugo start barking. Then, there was the hiss of Percy's sword leaving its sheath, and Felicity's chanting stopped mid-word. There was a long sigh, deep and echoing with a sibilance that set Alistair's hair on end. Certainly, mortal, you did not expect this to work. He opened his eyes, and he froze when he saw the demonic creature. It towered over all of them, regarding them with tired, fathomless eyes. Felicity didn't look up, but the manner of the spell she was casting abruptly changed, and he felt something like a tether join the shield around his mind, connecting him to her. Percy stepped between the pair of them and the demonic creature. "Get back, demon!" he growled. Hugo braced himself next to his master, hackles raised at the creature. How bothersome, the creature sighed, and Alistair felt lethargy descend on his mind. "No, no," Percy said, his voice thickening. "We won't submit, demon." "Somebody pinch me?" Alistair murmured, his eyelids drooping. Felicity continued chanting, even as her head started nodding. Percy was the first to drop, his hound collapsing beside him with a whine. The room swayed around Alistair, and he fought to keep his grip on those meditations. However, they slipped away, buried under the realization that this was a perfect place to take a nap. "Yep. Nap time." Felicity mumbled one last thing with a flash of light flying between them, just as Alistair spiraled down into slumberland. He was therefore rather surprised when he opened his eyes a moment later, and realized that he was still in the circle tower. He sat up, rubbing his head where he'd hit it when he'd fallen. Something was different, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. At least he'd fallen on one of the soft carpets that the mages decorated their tower with. Wait, why had he fallen, again? He climbed to his feet, dusting off his armor. He paused in confusion, his fingers lingering over the Templar logo on his chest plate. That wasn't right. Was it? "Alistair. Dozing off on the job again, are you?" One of his comrades laughed, poking a helmeted head into the room. Strangely, his fellow Templar's name escaped him at the moment. "Honestly, I'm feeling a bit muddled," Alistair said, rubbing his forehead. "Some apprentice's prank, no doubt. By the Maker, the little terrors should all be made tranquil." "That's an awful thing to say." His friend laughed, holding up his hands in defeat. I know. Alistair, defender of the weak and obnoxious, and all that. Now come on, the Knight Commander will have your head if you're late to your post." Alistair nodded and followed his fellow Templar out of the room, though he still couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He was supposed to be doing something, wasn't he? Maybe he was just late for his post, as his friend said. They wound through the corridors of the circle tower, weaving around the mages that scurried to and fro like rats in a larder. Most mages avoided the pair of them, many pretending they didn't exist. This was normal, a Templar got used to withstanding their contempt. Most Templars returned that contempt tenfold, but Alistair had never really been able to hate the mages on principle like that. Just a few in particular. Though he did have a healthy fear, respect for their spells. He had a distinct memory of being fried by a fireball once, though he couldn't recall for certain when that had actually happened. He followed his friend through the corridors and down a level, to a small study that was often used by the enchanters to get work done when they didn't want the lesser mages and apprentices bothering them. He hid a smile as he saw just who was making use of that study. Felicity sent him a pointed glare over her book, then turned nonchalantly back to whatever paper she was currently working on. Alistair bit the inside of his cheeks to keep from grinning like a moron as he took up his post by the study door. The Templar he was replacing saluted, and both other Templars marched off, leaving him alone with the mage. "Honestly, Alistair," Felicity tooted, snapping her book shut and sending him a withering glare. "You couldn't be any less subtle if you painted a sign in the Great Hall." Alistair shrugged, unrepentant, and allowed his grin free rein. "Not my fault I like watching you. Even better that I'm duty-bound to do it." She just rolled her eyes and shuffled through her papers. "I don't see what could be so interesting about watching me pore through old books." He closed the door quietly, then wandered over to the table she had commandeered. "Well, for one thing, when the others ask me what the tower's newest enchanter is up to, I can answer them." She smiled up at him teasingly. "So you're spying on me? I should have expected as much." "Nah, I just like to sound smart. I don't get to do it all that often, you know." Her dark eyes softened. "Oh, I think you're plenty smart about the things that matter." He once again felt that urge to reach out and touch her. This time, he gave in, running one gauntleted hand over her cheek. Yes, but you, my dear enchanter, are unashamedly biased. I do believe you're correct. Her eyes sparkled, and she carefully set her papers down. She stood up, and something about the enchanter robes she wore seemed strange. Well, she was still recently promoted. He hadn't gotten used to seeing her out of basic mage robes yet. That had to be it. Is something wrong? He glanced up, startled, to see her watching him with concern. Seeing no point in hiding it, she'd ferret it out anyway. He rubbed his head and admitted, I've been feeling a bit muddled. The other Templars think an apprentice must have cast a spell on me as a prank. She placed a hand on his shoulder and sent a burst of magic through him. From anyone else, he would have been nervous, but this was Felicity. Then, she smiled teasingly again. Well, I don't sense any entropic spells on you. What I do sense, however, is that you have a bruise on the back of your head. How might that have come about? I fell. You know, for a trained warrior, you are awfully clumsy. She reached up to run a hand through his hair, and his breath hitched. She whispered a healing spell, and the ache in the back of his head abated. When she started to pull away, he caught her arms with his own. I do it so that you can have a reason to heal me. We both know how much you like taking care of me. Her eyes sparkled, and Alistair's heart skipped in his chest. Her fingers smoothed over his scalp. Yes, almost as much as you like protecting me. He grinned in defeat, and she pulled him down into a kiss. His heart pounded as their lips met, and confusion roiled through his mind. Her lips were soft and warm, and he felt a headiness come over him like he'd never felt at the mere touch. But that couldn't be right. This was hardly their first kiss. Was it? He stiffened, confused, and Felicity drew back with a furrowed brow. She studied him for a moment. Perhaps it wasn't the bump on your head after all. Are you still feeling off? Something's wrong. Alistair stepped back, his hand dropping to his sword as he looked around the study. For the briefest of moments, he had a bizarre double vision experience, where he spied, instead of the circle tower, a twisted plain scattered with gnarled plants. A nightmarish world. Wait, nightmare. The sloth demon. Oh Maker. That magical shield around his mind flickered into feeble existence, and his true memories resurfaced in a tidal wave. His first action after recalling just what was going on was to stare at Felicity and blush so badly that he feared his face might combust. Felicity looked worried, now. She took a step toward him, and he stepped back. Alistair. Are you all right? Oh Maker. He'd, and she'd, and they'd. He might faint, he really might. He couldn't say he regretted it, and it did make certain things make a lot more sense, but by Andrasta, what a way to figure it out. Alistair. Now she looked hurt, and that made him regret his hesitation. This isn't real, he blurted unceremoniously. Okay, now she looked really hurt. And a little pissed off. Is this your idea of calling this off? What? No. That's not what I meant. Primarily because there's nothing to call off, but that's not the point dash. Nothing to call off. She now looked furious. Alistair, I'd have at least thought you'd be a gentleman about this. I thought you different from other Templars. That's not by the Maker. He reached forward and grabbed her by the shoulders, even as she tried to back away. Felicity, you are the most brilliant person I know. Just think for a minute. This isn't real. You're not an enchanter, you're a Grey Warden. We both are. A Grey Warden. Her brows knit in confusion. Why would I become a Grey Warden? I'm perfectly content here, at the tower. With you. Again, he felt himself blush. Right, yes. Remind me again, then, how exactly we got together. Is this supposed to be funny? You know that. Maybe I hit my head harder than we thought. Humor me. She rolled her eyes, then froze, her brows again knitting in confusion mid-roll. We met when you came to the tower. When? What did I say? Her eyes narrowed in thought. Something about lyrium. About not having completed your vows. But that can't be right, you wouldn't have been allowed into the tower if you hadn't. Right, because we had that conversation on the bridge at Ostagar. Do you remember Ostagar? She blinked. I do. We fought Darkspawn, and there was some kind of ritual? But how could that be? I've never been out of the tower. Yes, you have, he assured her earnestly. You know something feels wrong. Trust that feeling, or failing that, trust that this place obviously follows no rightful rules of logic. Just look at me, could you really see me as a full Templar? Felicity bit her lip in thought. You'd probably go mad and take your sword to the nearest chantry podium. Exactly, because I'm much happier as a Grey Warden. And until a couple minutes ago, I thought you were too. He couldn't hide his disappointment. She stepped away, running her hands over the books on the desk. I suppose I would be more productive as a warden, at least, she said ponderously. An enchanter's life would be nice. I'd get full access to the vaults, and I think that I would love teaching the apprentices, but to what ultimate end is such a life? You make small difference to anyone outside the tower, which exists as an island by itself. Compounded by the fact that it is, in fact, on an island. She smiled, but it was a sad one. I might have ended up like this, had Duncan not asked me to come with him. In the tower. Continuing to my studies. Idle. Her brows knit. Which would explain why a sloth demon would put me in this dream, to keep me complacent and to feed upon my unproductivity. And so why would I be here, then? Alistair said, tapping the Templar crest on his chest plate. I can't say I ever dream of Templars, except for the occasional one about smacking my old trainer in the face with a shovel. She turned to look at him, as if for the first time, and he knew the moment when everything finally snapped into place by the blush that shot up to the tips of her ears. Oh, Alistair. I'm so sorry. This isn't your dream, it's mine. Her eyes dropped, and her shoulders hunched up in embarrassment. It must be horrifying, to have been caught in such a compulsion, to correspond with the dream like that. Wait, a compulsion. Well, this dreamscape is designed to follow closely with my deepest desires, or something else that would provoke an entropic response, I suppose. When the sloth demon discovered us, I realized I wouldn't have enough time to finish the ritual to make you completely immune to its effects, and so I switched the spell to one that linked us psychically. As such, it seems you were pulled into the same reality as I was, and were thus forced to live out the reality of my dreams. You dream we're having a secret affair in the Circle Tower. His head spun. She still didn't look at him. Well, me being an enchanter was certainly something I used to aspire to. And as for you, it's an obvious holdover from Cullen, isn't it? Following my brief involvement with him to the logical conclusion. Thus why it was projected onto you, as an obvious substitute. So, you thought I was Cullen. He winced, that thought hurt. Well, it makes the most sense, don't you think? She met his gaze, eyes hooded. What else could it be? He sighed, feeling an ache in his chest he wasn't sure what to do with. All that had just been part of the dream. The feelings he was having for her weren't real? No, that couldn't be right. He'd been feeling this before the sloth demon had come along. But it was obvious that the same wasn't true for her. No, you're probably right. As usual. He couldn't look at her, instead electing to look around the room. He didn't want her to see his disappointment. So now that we're both awake, so to speak, how do we get out of here? There should be a portal connecting this area of the realm to the others that the sloth demon holds, for ease of transit. We'll be able to see it once I dispel the illusion, give me a moment. She closed her eyes, and Alistair felt free to look at her again. She wasn't beautiful in a classic way, he supposed, but something in his heart still tugged as he watched her, biting her lip in concentration and with her brow furrowed. She had long, silky black hair that he just wanted to run his hands through, because it looked so soft. Her figure was equally soft, and Alistair mused that it might be rather pleasant to hold such gentle curves at some point when their lives weren't at stake. And her eyes, when they were open, had such spark and wit in them, hinting at the ever-active mind behind it. It was smart of the sloth demon to try to trap her in a tower full of books, because nothing else could have possibly distracted an ever-curious mind like that of Felicity Amell. After a minute or two, the tower around Alistair started wavering, the walls becoming transparent to reveal that nightmarish landscape behind them. After another minute, the circle tower disappeared entirely, and they were standing in a barren, gnarled area. Alistair looked up into the sky, and shuddered as he spotted a city on a distant crag. The Black City, the source of all this corruption and the reason why mages were so dangerous. He may not have paid too much attention when the sisters tried to teach him the chant as a child, but that, he remembered vividly. There are some indications, you know, that the Black City was corrupted before the Tevinter Magisters got there, Felicity's voice said, and Alistair glanced over at her, trying to hide his nervousness. As opposed to it being the golden seed of the Maker, that is. Some accounts claim that it was the city that corrupted the Magisters, rather than the other way around. The Chantry lets such stories into the tower. Not directly. But when under such an obviously biased thumb, one learns to read between the lines. She sighed. I suppose it doesn't matter what corrupted what, in any case. The result was the same, regardless. She turned away and started walking up a sloping ravine. Keep an eye out, there will likely be a couple lesser demons around to keep an eye on us. Alistair dutifully put a hand on his sword, but nonetheless tried for a smirk. So our babysitters don't look kindly on us breaking out of our cribs? Pity. I was looking forward to snack time. She chuckled, and he felt a bit of that hurt from earlier fade. Do you think dream cheese is as good as real cheese? Why does everyone pick on that? So I like cheese, it's not unusual to have a favorite food, you know. Unless you're some sort of undead, I suppose. You know, I never really thought about that. Do walking corpses need to eat? Felicity, to his amusement, treated it like a real question. No. Not in the way we do, anyway. Such undead are the result of lesser demons possessing the newly deceased. As such, it is the demon that must sustain itself, and they are perfectly capable of eating off strong emotions. Often in the most unproductive ways, actually, as that usually means they provoke such emotions from unwary mortals by attacking and killing them. A somewhat short-sighted means to go about it, come to think of it. Well, no one ever accused the dead of having good foresight. There was a cry from up ahead, and Alistair's Templar friend from earlier rounded into view in the path. There was no fun banter this time, more's the pity, as the Templar raised his sword to attack. Alistair wasted no time in drawing his own blade and stepping in front of Felicity, even as she started casting. The charging Templar demon bounced off his shield with a clang, and Alistair's sword swooped in, cutting through the Templar's armor like butter. That's an illusion too. He muttered as he neatly impaled the creature on his sword, and the Templar faded in a gush of brimstone-scented smoke. More Templar-shaped demons were pouring in from around the landscape now, and Alistair charged up to meet each in turn. He felt the hum of magic wrap around him, and for a moment panicked, looking for an enemy mage, but then realized it was bolstering his strength. He cast a grin back at his own personal support mage and cleaved a circle of demonic death around her. A dozen demons surrounded them, Templar and mage-shaped alike. The former charged at him with swords swinging, while the latter stayed in back to sling destructive spells at the pair of them. Felicity constructed a glowing ball around herself that deflected the magic attacks, leaving it to Alistair to slice through the creatures one by one. He trusted his body to her healing as he felt demonic swords slice into his back and legs. When a fireball caught him clear in the face, a burst of healing immediately afterward made him grin and smash the offending mage to the other side of the fade with his shield. It was rather cathartic, honestly, to bash his way through the evil creatures that took such forms. Stabbing Templars proved a good release for old frustrations accumulated from years of enduring the scoldings of the lay sisters and the harsher punishments of Templar training. And as for the mages, well, it became a great deal of fun to knock them down, as he imagined one had Jowan's face, then Morrigan's, then Khazar's, then back to Jowan's. Percy had a point. The only decent mage was Felicity. After a frantic 5 minutes or so, things settled down, and Alistair was left panting and grinning on a field devoid of any more enemies. He met Felicity's gaze to find her face glowing with victory. Their eyes met, and Alistair was overcome with the desire to march over to her, sweep her into his arms, and kiss her. No, definitely not the work of the sloth demon, that. He broke his gaze away before he actually did something so monumentally stupid as that. Because, really, things were awkward enough already. So he cleared his throat and put his sword away. Such a fuss kicked up over little old us. You'd think we'd kicked their dogs, or something. Felicity started leading them up the path again. Maybe you did, in a dream, and simply don't recall it. Alistair fell into step beside her. What? I'm insulted. I have never kicked any dogs, imaginary or otherwise, and I am heartbroken that you would accuse me of something so awful. She arched an eyebrow, eyes sparkling. Says the man who just wiped a good dozen sentient creatures out of existence. You've obviously never learned the Templar Code of Honor. Stabbing and killing things, especially mages, is honorable and a matter of duty. Hurting a cute little puppy is a thing worthy of scorn and as such will not be tolerated. Especially in Ferelden. Ah, I see. One must never dare harm a dog in Ferelden, after all. Alistair nodded sagely. They're practically avatars of Andraste, if you ask the nobility. He paused, smirking as a thought came to him. What do you suppose Percy would do if we erected an altar for Hugo? Like, put a crown on him and started worshipping him as a god? Would he find it funny, do you think, or would he murder us all in a fit of rage? Felicity laughed, and he forgave her, then and there, for any pain he'd been feeling about her not returning his feelings. I suspect he'd primarily be confused, and ask whether we'd lost our minds. Well, that question would have been far more timely earlier. Say, about the time we accepted Morrigan's help. I personally started suspecting around then that we were all crazy. Speak for yourself, Alistair. She laughed. Right, because there's nothing mad about walking into a circle tower on lockdown because it's invaded by powerful demons and blood mages, knowing full well that there was no way out again, should you even survive and not be captured. Yep, that sounds like a perfectly sane course of action. And so where does that put you, who did the same without even any prior experience with the tower? He grinned. See, I'm the big dumb sword jockey, so I'm allowed to do crazy stuff like that. You're brilliant, so you should know better. Her face went red, and she looked away. He wondered if he'd said something wrong. After a moment, she mumbled, You're not dumb, Alistair. He shrugged, and now it was his turn to look away, because he didn't want her to see how much hearing that from her meant to him. They walked in awkward silence for a couple minutes. Then, they turned a corner and came upon a shiny portal in the middle of the path. This must be it, Felicity said. She stepped up to it and ran a hand along the twisted frame. This will take us to another part of the sloth demon's realm, though it's impossible to guess where. So, we just step through? Like it's not all glowing and creepy. Unless you wish to stay here for the rest of eternity, yes. Alistair glanced behind them, back over the cracked, twisted landscape. You're the mage. Lead the way. She nodded and stepped through, disappearing into it with a flash of light. He swallowed a lump in his throat and quickly followed. It was like being dunked into a tub of cold water, an abrupt, encompassing sensation that seemed to seep chillingly into his bones. But a moment later, it had passed, and he was standing on solid ground that looked a great deal like the place they'd just left. There were two exceptions to that, though. One was a glowing podium with an open book on top of it. The other was a man in ragged mage robes slumped against it, his head dropped into the cradle of his arms in apparent despair. Felicity stood next to Alistair, also getting her bearings. She cast an assessing gaze over Alistair, as if to make sure he was all right, and he couldn't deny that he quickly did the same for her. Then, Felicity turned, spotted the mage, and said, Niall. Slowly, she started toward the podium, and Alistair followed right on her heels with his hand on his sword, in case this was just another demon. The man at the podium slowly raised his head and blinked at them with deadened eyes. Wah! Felicity Amel. He said thickly. What are you doing here? You weren't in the tower. I came back. Felicity's steps sped up, and she was soon standing next to the other mage, examining him with that healer's eye of hers. Felicity, who is this? Alistair asked, not sure whether he could take his hand off his sword yet. Oh, right. Alistair, this is Niall, one of the tower's more advanced mages. Niall, this is Alistair. The mage used the podium to stand up straight, relatively anyway, even upright. He seemed to sag. The mage looked at Alistair, perplexed. A Templar? I was under the impression you'd all either been ensnared or had left. Alistair was confused for a moment. Then, he realized that he was still in the Templar armor, just as Felicity was still wearing the enchanter robes. I'm not actually a Templar. Felicity, why am I still a Templar? It's the manner of the Fade, Alistair. It's all about what mental image you project. You could likely change it if you wanted to, but it can be difficult, especially for non-mages. Unless you want to risk running around in your skivvies for the remainder of our stay, it may be better to leave the armor as is. Alistair tapped the steel chest plate, then shrugged. At least it's protective. I still don't understand, Niall said, looked between them. Felicity, you should not be here. You left the circle, why would you come back? I couldn't simply let demons destroy the tower, she said. She's a little bit of a busybody, like that, Alistair added lightly. And now you're trapped here. The mage sighed and looked down at the book in front of them. I suppose that explains the new additions to the Nexus. You'll find no exit this way, I'm afraid. Not one that's easy to decipher anyway. He trailed off and looked at Felicity for a moment. Though I suppose if anyone can find a way to use this, it would be you. Felicity blushed but nodded and stepped up to peer over the book. What is this? It's a map, as far as I can tell. It keeps moving and shifting, and spots keep appearing and disappearing. I can only assume as different dreamers are captured in the case of the former, and then, for the latter, when they die. He frowned and pointed to a blank spot on the map. There was one there a couple minutes ago, that one must have been yours. You've been studying it, then. Not much else to do. I can't say how long I've been here. Far too long, I fear. I feel so weak, so tired. He drooped a bit, then seemed to shake himself awake. But at least I managed to free myself of its illusion, that would have drained me far faster, I suspect. You mean like the illusions the others are caught in? Alistair asked worriedly. That's what I was afraid of, Felicity whispered. She cast an anxious glance back at him, and he wanted to kill anything that would frighten her like that. The others have been in the sloth demon's control for days. I managed to sustain their bodies, but their minds were being fed off of this entire time. So I guess there's no chance of them breaking out on their own, then. Niall was the one to answer, shaking his head sadly. If your friends haven't broken the illusion by now, then they probably never will. I'm sorry. I probably wouldn't have broken it either, Felicity sighed, if not for you, Alistair. Goody. Obviously, you just need to plop me in everyone else's dreams like you did your own. Maybe give Marnan and Percy a couple kisses, to shock them awake. To his surprise, Felicity froze. Abruptly, she spun and enveloped him in a hug. Alistair, that's brilliant. He blinked, very aware of her body pressed against him. Suddenly, when she smiled like this, he took back his previous thoughts about her not being beautiful. She was bloody gorgeous. And now her arms were wrapped around him, her weight pressed against him like she belonged there. He swallowed. You, want me to go into their dreams and kiss each of them? Perhaps, kissing wouldn't be necessary, she said, pulling back. Now her face was a little red, but she was still smiling. He couldn't resist reaching up to caress her cheek, because she was so beautiful like this it actually hurt not to touch her. She didn't seem to notice, as caught in her thoughts as she was. We can go into each dream and dispel the illusion. That will gather more forces for us to face the demon with, as well as force it out of hiding to reclaim its captives. We will then be able to confront Sloth directly and break the spell. It's perfect. Well, he said softly, you did say I'm not as dumb as everyone thinks. Guess it was inevitable that I'd prove you right. You're always right, after all. Not always. Her face flushed, and she stepped back. Alistair sighed at the loss. But in this, let us direly hope that I am. She turned her attention to the podium. Niall, explain to me everything that you've discovered about this book, and this realm in general. We need to use this map to link the portal here to each of these locations, and I suspect it will not be an easy task. Niall's smile was tired, but hope sparked in his eyes. No, probably not. But, it's not as if we have much else to do, is it? He and Felicity leaned over the podium and began talking about vertices and essences and other things that went right over the ex-Templar's head. And so, he found a twisted tree to lean against and relaxed, watching the mages. Or rather, he watched Felicity, in her element solving an impossible puzzle. An amazing woman. Intelligent. Caring. Lovely. Even her occasional bursts of self-righteous temper were only proof that she was fiercely passionate about what she cared about. Even if she didn't return his feelings, he was honored to be able to fight beside her. To protect her. Anyone who tried to hurt his mage would have to answer to his Templar-trained sword first. Even as the mages cast some sort of spell and Felicity beckoned Alistair back through the portal, he was chuckling at the irony. 59 An unwelcome inevitability. Garrot didn't know what was more surprising, that Leske turned and stabbed him in the back to defend his position as the local crime lord's second-in-command and plaything, or the fact that this didn't really surprise him at all. He pondered it, while he crouched over his former friend's body. Leske had always been an opportunist. He'd gained what little power he could, no doubt scraping his way up to the top over 100 other lives, but that was the risk everyone took when they joined the Carta. Landing on top of that deep stalker nest was an impressive feat. Took a lot of backstabbing. And front stabbing, side stabbing, head stabbing, just a lot of stabbing in general, really. Garrot couldn't hate Leske for betraying him. He probably would have done the same thing, and been more shrewd about it to boot. You poor son of a nug, he whispered, voice forcibly level as he closed his ex-partner's eyes. You picked the wrong bet to back. His throat tightened, and he cleared it. You always were a sodding lousy gambler. He remained crouched there while the other two looted the corpses, the dwarf working through his grief with the methodical patience of one who'd grown up in the instability of the slums. It would ache for a while, but he'd deal. Finally, he stood and looked around. Anything interesting? Only a rather remarkable set of documents in this chest, Morrigan hummed. She held up a stack of papers. They would be quite devastating to your prince friend's case, were they discovered. Suddenly, the papers erupted into a puff of fire, and Morrigan grinned. Whoops. How clumsy of me. Garrot grinned himself, nodding his approval. Sten, meanwhile, cast Morrigan a sideways look. Was giving all our opponents horrifying visions with magic truly necessary? Perhaps not, but 'twas fun. Sten rumbled a disapproving but accepted that and turned toward Garrot. We have cut off the head, but it is unlikely that the body will die. The seed of rebellion is not something that can wiped out so simply. Garrot shrugged. If it's good enough for Belen to give me my sodding army, that's fine with me. He snagged the remains of one of Jarvia's more brilliant traps, because he kind of wanted to reverse engineer it. Come on, let's get out of here. I never want to see this place again as long as I live. He led the pair out through what appeared to be a back exit. Sure enough, they emerged in an armorer's shop, much to the surprise of the rather startled armorer, who apparently had had no idea about the secret door into a criminal stronghold in his wall. It was lucky Jarvia had decided to stand and fight rather than escape. If she had been the first one out of that exit, she'd have probably killed him. And what sort of mess would that make for Belen's case? Triumphant, the trio returned to the palace. Belen was expecting them, and greeted them with noble words and a winning smile. Garrot nodded and spoke with appropriate respect, well, for him, anyway, but otherwise didn't pay much attention to the conversation. He was suddenly just too weary for all these games. And who could blame him? He'd just wiped out, single-handed, the organization that he'd worked for since he was 10. He'd killed his best friend and partner of 10 years. His sister was carrying an Ejican child, but there was no guarantee that if she birthed a daughter, the assembly wouldn't throw her into a magma pit, even if Belen did keep his word. It was all exhausting. With all that, on top of the blight, he felt overwhelmed. He even had the sudden urge to see Kala, his mother. Then, Belen gave them their next, and purportedly last, task, finding Branka. Sodding Branka. Paragon who disappeared into the deep roads 2 years prior. Branka. Garrot all but stormed out of the palace, and didn't say anything to either of his companions until they were in the merchant's quarter, pawning off the odds and ends they'd found stashed in the Karta hideout. Then, the tired, rusty wheels in his head started spinning, and he found himself staring at a hunk of lyrium ore up for sale, trying to think of how the blazes the three of them were going to survive the deep sodding roads. "We're gonna need a map," he groaned. "Beg pardon, Warden?" Morrigan asked offhandedly. She was admiring a jeweled mirror on the merchant's shelves. "A map of the deep roads. We're gonna need one," Sten said. "I take it finding such a thing is not that easy." "Nope." Garrot turned and started away from the stall, and the pair followed, reluctantly, in Morrigan's case. "Thing is, anything the Shape Rate has upstairs will be sodding old. The place will have collapsed and been retunneled by Spawn in the meantime. Might as well be working blind." He stopped them in an alcove off the square and rubbed the exhaustion from his face. "Only two kinds of people might have a good one. Grey Wardens and the Legion of the Dead. I ain't gotta tell you why finding Wardens with maps is a problem, and the Legion, well, if you get far enough into the deep roads that you find the Legion, you don't need the sodding map in the first place." "It seems to me," Morrigan said, "that what we require is not a map, but a guide." "Guides who'd be either Wardens or Legion," Garrot said. "Same problem." "Has not." Sten began, then cut himself off. That made Garrot arch a brow. Since when was the Cunary hesitant about anything? "You got an idea, big guy?" Sten sighed through his nose and shifted, and yep, that was definitely discomfort. "Interesting. I am given to understand that one of your fellow Wardens has frequently been involved in military expeditions into the deep roads." Garrot stiffened. "You mean Marnan?" "Yes. The female Karastan." He paused, then said quickly. "I cannot understand how such a thing might be so, that a woman would function as a soldier, but that is what I am told is the way of it. Correct me if I am mistaken." Garrot couldn't help but be amused by that. Stenny was weirded out by ladies in armor? Huh. Who knew? "No, you ain't wrong, and I'd bet my boots the princess would deck you for saying what you just did. You got a problem with women warriors, big guy." Morrigan huffed and crossed her arms. "It is not a woman's place," Sten said. Garrot snorted. "Yeah, definitely don't say that in front of the princess." He shook his head incredulously. "You are missing the point," Sten said sharply. "If she has, indeed, been part of military campaigns into the deep roads, then it would stand to reason that she would retain knowledge of them." "Ah, I get what you're getting at. And, no. There's not a nug's chance in Dust Town that I'm going running to the princess for help." "I see. I had thought you had no other viable plan for how we will survive the deep roads," Sten deadpanned. "It seems I was mistaken, or you would not dismiss this one so quickly." Garrot glared up at the Cunary, who returned the look flatly. "It seems to me," Morrigan put in, "that the chances of anyone being able to track this woman are slim, particularly if she has been gone for such a very long time. Why not simply venture forth and let what comes come?" Garrot sighed and shook his head. "Bad idea." He unhooked his hand axe and flipped it while he thought. "Look, even with a map, dragging you two down there is a gamble. It's a big darkspawn nest, literally. Chances are better than not that you'll catch the taint and die." He froze as his mind caught up to his words. Son of a sod-swilling noble hunting whore. These two weren't Wardens. If they caught the taint, then it would be Garrot alone against the entire whole damn horde, and even he wasn't slippery enough to survive sheer numbers on that scale all alone. He turned and banged his forehead against the nearest wall. "Are you well, Warden?" Morrigan prodded doubtfully. "Sod it. Sten's right. We're gonna need backup." Sten hummed, as if it was a foregone conclusion. "You have assured us that you are not suicidal. Although the truth of that statement is yet to be determined." "Thank you, Sten, for the ringing endorsement." Garrot sighed and turned to address them. "Morrigan, I need you to take a message to Redcliffe." "Why must it be me, I wonder?" she said with narrowed eyes. Garrot arched an eyebrow. "Unless you know of a way to make dwarves and Cunary fly, I'm gonna say because you can get there the stone damned fastest. Besides, weren't you saying the other day how much you hated this stinking hole in the ground? Morrigan sighed. Oh, very well. I shall do thy bidding, as usual. As it should be, Sten said with something that, on him, counted as a smirk. And you, my large associate, Morrigan rejoined sourly, are lucky that I do not turn you into a toad. She waved a dismissive hand and started off toward the Orzammer exit. Do enjoy your hole in the ground, boys. I will be flying free as a bird. As a bird, at that. Garrot snorted and watched her go, then turned to his stoic companion. In the meantime, come on, Sten. He started walking, this time beelining for tapsters. You stopped Jarvia's daggers from filleting my ass. You may not like to be paid, but by my reckoning, that means I owe you a sodding drink. And you're going to take it, whether you like it or not. That's a sodding order. Sten followed behind Garrot as he made his way up the tavern steps, fully intending to get the both of them thoroughly drunk after a day like that. And by the stone if the cunnery wasn't smiling, just a little bit. 60 The lighter side of undead invasions. Finian picked idly at the lyre's strings, wincing as every couple notes came out sounding like they'd been picked specifically to sound the most discordant possible. It had been a surprise when Sorel had presented him with the finely carved Dalish lyre, a gift for putting the curse to rest. Apparently, it had belonged to the storyteller's late wife, and Finian hadn't had the heart to turn the gift down. If I may be so bold, my friend, may I ask who taught you to play in such a distinctive manner? The assassin's Antivan accent always made him shiver a little bit, because damn. I fear that I might need to track them down and murder them, so that they do not spread such a technique to other people. Finian smirked, glancing up at the man walking beside him. No one taught me. I'd never touched a lyre in my life before a couple days ago. He turned back to his instrument, plucking out a string of notes that didn't sound half bad. But there is a minstrel who's supposed to meet us in Redcliffe. I'm hoping she can teach me. Ah. It is a good thing then, that we are almost there, yes? I would so hate to have to smash such a beautifully made instrument. There was a snigger from behind them. You know, I think the assassin's growing on me. Finian turned his head to look at Khazar, who, despite his protests that he didn't need charity from any Dalish, was still wearing the keeper's robes which Linnea had presented him with. Like the lyre, the defensively enchanted robes were a gift for fixing the curse, and also to replace those Finian himself had torn. Finn suppressed a wince at that thought and turned back around, once again consuming himself in practicing the instrument. He could see Mila and the white wolf dubbed Fang at some point ranging ahead, scouting for friends and foes alike. Every time he glimpsed the wolf, a spike of shame shot through him. So far, though, he'd done well at hiding it from his companions. The four of them had been traveling out of Lothering for a couple days, now, and could see Lake Callanhood in the distance to their right. It wouldn't be long before they reached the keep. Finn hoped that then, at least, he could have a moment of privacy to thoroughly freak out. Bottling it up for so long could not be healthy. It wasn't just the long, horrid hours he'd spent as a werewolf, consumed by a monstrous rage. It wasn't even just the fact that he'd attacked his companions, nearly killing Khazar. No, the most terrifying thought about the entire ordeal had been right before his transformation. The awful things that had just poured out of his mouth, verbal barbs meant to hurt his companions. He hadn't known he was capable of such cruelty, that the things he noticed about other people could be turned into weapons like that. And then, there was the most terrifying part of all. Mila and Khazar had said they weren't mad at him for manipulating them into allying with the werewolves, and the scary thing was, neither was he. In his feverish, temperamental state of mind, he had coldly weighed the possibilities, predicting his companions' actions on their personalities and motives. He'd weighed them against his own, and he'd spoken a couple words that would best prompt each to do what he wanted them to, even if he wouldn't be there to direct them at the time. All this was done in a flash of insight, laid bare by the raw emotions summoned up by the curse. And Finian wasn't sorry he'd done it. He was horrified, certainly, but not sorry. It had most likely saved his companions' lives, as well as the lives of any of the werewolves that they might have killed before being slain themselves. And right before he'd changed, The thought had crossed his mind that he was glad he'd been cursed, because it meant the two stubborn wardens were far more inclined to try lifting the curse instead of simply slaughtering the beasts. Garrot had called it far before Finian could have realized. He was one manipulative son of a nug. And he wasn't sorry. He would do it again, because it had saved lives. He glanced over at the assassin now. The Antivan hummed quietly to himself, seemingly just so he didn't have to hear Finn's lyre. The acquisition of the assassin had been a calculated move on his part. No pretense. No lying to himself. He had straight up worked the situation like clay, and now they had a trained assassin who was willing to kill Loghain for them, if need be. Something in Finian quailed at that thought of sending an assassin to eliminate their foe, and perhaps that was why he hadn't sent the crow to do exactly that. No, for now, the assassin was merely a card up the sleeve they could pull out as necessary. No need to show their tricks so early in the game. Finn wondered how far he could take his silver tongue. What else could he lie about and still get positive results? Could a couple words in the right ear stop the civil war? Could a proper application of sheer charisma help them rally forces for the Blight? His silver tongue was his greatest weapon. Why shouldn't he use it, if the results benefited the common good? Grey Wardens did what had to be done to stop the Blight, that's what Duncan had always said. So what if that meant pulling a couple strings, to make it so? This realization about himself thoroughly freaked him out, but he didn't dare show any of it to his companions. They saw the castle in the distance as the sun was setting, the stone walls in stark silhouette against the twilight sky. It would likely take another hour, at least, for them to reach it. "We should make camp here," Mila said, coming back from scouting as the sun touched the horizon. The four stopped in the middle of the mountain path. "We can go the rest of the distance tomorrow." "Why not go the rest of the distance tonight?" Khazar asked irritably, leaning on his staff. "I, for one, thoroughly miss sleeping in a bed." "Maybe they'll be low on rooms at the inn, and we'll all have to share a bed," Zevran said with exaggerated hopefulness. Khazar snorted. "Did you hear the word sleep, assassin? That was my operative word. Something tells me what you have in mind is anything but. Also, you." Finian sniggered. "I think I'm insulted." "You don't think I'm handsome, Khazar?" Zevran grinned. "I, for one, think you're quite handsome," he purred theatrically. "Though not as handsome as I, of course." "Of course. I swear I'm going to blast you both," Khazar said flatly. "Right in your handsome faces if need be." Finn and Zevran both laughed. The assassin, he'd found, appreciated the sport of riling the mage as much as anyone else, though he was careful not to do it unless Finian initiated. A good self-preservation instinct, as far as Finn was concerned. The flirting was something that had emerged over the last couple days. The assassin flirted blatantly with all three of them, despite the fact that both Mila and Khazar were obviously not interested. As for Finian, well, the other elf certainly was handsome. And that accent was just short of hypnotic. If the other elf made a serious offer, Finn didn't see any reason he'd turn it down. Who knew, it may serve as a welcome distraction from a certain other companion of his. But as far as he could tell, the assassin's flirtations were just that, merely meant to tease and play. There was no real guarantee that Zevran was even inclined toward men, and Finian wasn't going to make any moves until he knew that for sure. Sex was a touchy subject in Ferelden, particularly when it involved anything other than a man and a woman in a chantry-ordained marriage bed. Finian didn't know much about Antivan thoughts on the subject, but he didn't want to insult their new companion by making any assumptions one way or another. So, for now, he just played along. Mila was frowning impatiently. She had once again become cold and detached since the crow had joined them. Finn turned to her. "Many indoors have locks, Mila. If we sleep in Red Cliff, you won't have to stay up all night, staring at Zevran's tent in case he decides he's changed his mind about murdering us." Mila stiffened guiltily. "What is to stop him from sneaking into our rooms? He claims he can pick locks." "Exactly. Claims. Ah, Warden, I am wounded by your lack of faith in my abilities." Finn cast the crow an incredulous look. The chest near the spider's nest. A shameless grin met him. It was a difficult lock. The bandit stash. My pick broke. The child's lockbox. I was struck by conscience, and could not bear to open so private a treasure. Finn smirked and turned back to Mila. He can't pick locks. Also, he's an awful liar. If I am so awful at lying, then why did you believe me when I told you I could pick locks in the first place? Mila sighed and nonetheless turned to head back up the path toward the distant castle. The other three followed behind. It's lucky Finn's got his kit, Khazar snarked. If stuck with the crow, we wouldn't be able to open our own eyes without a key. At generating eye-opening experiences, I am quite skilled, Zevran quickly rejoined, still grinning. Care for a demonstration, my young friend? Sure, if I can demonstrate on you what I do to lecherous old men who can't take no for an answer. Here's a hint, it involves a very specific application of ice magic. Yes, I can see how that would be quite effective at making your point. Has anyone ever told you that you'd make a very convincing crow interrogator? Has anyone ever told you shut up? Why, yes, as a matter of fact. Many times. Yet I am quite incorrigible, or so I have been told. You know what? Me saying earlier that you were growing on me? Yeah, I take that back. Except maybe growing like some awful fungus that's difficult to get rid of. Up ahead of them, Mila stopped walking and drew her bow, and the rest of them immediately forgot the conversation and fell silent. Finian had often wondered why Mila's sense for danger seemed so much keener than the rest of them, but, with how often it had saved their hides, he wasn't complaining. Finian slipped the liar's strap around his back and stepped up lightly to draw even with the archer, who had her bow raised toward something ahead of them. 10 feet in front of her, Fang growled, hackles raised at something Finn couldn't see. Then, figures lumbered toward them over the crest of the hill, and something about their jerky, slow movements made Finian shiver. What is that? Undead, Mila said softly. What? Khazar came up next to them on the archer's other side. You can't be serious. Why would there be undead here? Believe me, Dalithalan, once you've seen walking corpses, you do not forget them. Those are undead, without doubt. Then it seems it falls to us to make them re-dead, yes. Zevran chuckled, twirling his sword and dagger in lazy circles. Finn smirked, his own daggers springing into his palms with a twist of his wrists. Is killing the already dead covered in crow training, assassin? Not as such, no. But one would think the principle is the same, yes. Khazar snorted. Let's test that, shall we? The mage swept his staff forward, and a lightning bolt crackled through the darkness. Finn blinked away the afterimage of the bolt, and saw the crackling glow of electricity still bouncing around the cluster of undead. The creatures jerked and screeched as bolts streaked between them, and Finn could see smoke rising against the twilit sky. And then, to Finn's surprise, they continued shambling toward them, as if nothing had happened. Mila's bowstring twanged, taking one through the throat. It didn't even slow down. Guess not, the crow tsked. He waggled his eyebrows at Finn. Shall we, my deadly little warden? Finn nodded and they ran forward together, meeting the shambling corpses with blades spinning. Finn plunged his daggers into one corpse's eye sockets, and then ducked as it swiped out at him with open hands in the next moment. He slid around behind it, slicing its neck half off. It lurched to the side, and Finn rolled to dodge a strike from another corpse. A moment later, that corpse was encased in ice, its rotting flesh made brittle with frost. Finn leapt in and stabbed his daggers into the two delicate points at the shoulders, and the brittle ice fractured and cracked. The entire thing shattered, leaving a gooey mess on the ground that had Zevran laughing something along the lines of, "Must you show off so blatantly, Warden?" The assassin wasn't doing badly himself. His sword certainly seemed to be doing more damage on the creatures than Finn's daggers. Still, Finian wasn't about to be outdone by the crow. He moved swiftly to his next opponent, dodging easily between a pair of the slow-moving monsters. His next opponent was the one with Mila's arrow in its throat. He reached up to grip that arrow and pulled the corpse around, making it stumble as it sluggishly tried to correct its weight. With his free hand, he stabbed it 4 times in quick succession along the spine, then kicked it to the ground, where it twitched and moaned, but seemed unable to stand again. Then, fire blasted behind him, and 2 of the creatures went down in flames. This left one last corpse standing, already blinded by an arrow sticking out of each eye. Zevran and Finian raced against one another to take it down, and it finally collapsed as the assassin's 2-handed slash cut its head cleanly from its body. Khazar and Mila approached and stood over the corpses while the melee fighters cleaned the gore off their blades. Khazar scowled at Fang, who still growled from 20 feet away, having stayed out of the fight. "What's the matter, Wolfie? Don't like pre-dead meat?" "He is not a slave," Mila snapped irritably. "Do not treat him as such." "What? I was just asking it a question." Finn kicked at one of the corpses that still twitched on the ground. "Khazar, can I get a light please?" The mage grumbled, but nonetheless came closer. A moment later, a ball of flame sprang to life in his free hand, illuminating the path in flickering orange. Finian studied the corpses, taking in the features and clothing under the various bits of gore. "They're guards and elves." Zevran nodded. "Such people one might find working at a noble's estate, yes." In a sing-song voice, Khazar said, "Someone's been messing with demons." "Alistair and Percival should have been here before us," Mila said. She, too, knelt beside the corpses, her face grim. Something must have happened to them, to allow this. Finian felt the bottom drop out of his stomach, because she was right. "Percy. We have to get to the castle," Finn said, standing. "That's where our leman should be, so that's where they would have gone." The others nodded, and they took off up the path at nearly a run. Other clumps of undead met them on their way, but they were swiftly dispatched with a blast of lightning and a swipe of Zevran's sword. They passed a couple buildings that marked the outskirts of a village, but each was dark, probably abandoned. Then, they reached a bridge over a waterfall and stopped, staring at the stream of undead pouring down the hill in front of them. They were about 50 feet from a fork, one path leading through a gate and up a winding hill toward the castle. The other fork led down, past a windmill, to the town proper. Going down that fork was a stream of undead, not an unmanageable horde, but certainly a steady line. Set in front of the windmill below were a set of wooden barricades, where a rather scraggly group of defenders seemed to be holding the undead back, though barely. As Finn watched, a shambling corpse slipped through the line and shoved one defender off the cliff, only to have a knight kick it over after its victim. Bodies littered the ground around the barricades, and it was nearly impossible to tell which belonged to the undead, and which to the defenders. "Enough of this," Khazar hissed in frustration. He stepped forward and planted his feet, then let out a vicious stream of fire that lit up the entire pathway, from barricades to gate, hitting every undead in sight down to the last. Finian had to avert his eyes from how bright it was in the night. The groans and creaks that filled the air stopped, replaced by crackling and the sounds of the burned-out corpses collapsing. A moment later, Khazar sagged against his staff, and Finian grabbed his elbow to help keep him on his feet. In the distance, they could hear the raised shouts and cheers from the defenders, and a couple of them broke through the barricades to greet them. "Praise the Maker, Androsta answered our prayers again." "Thank you," cried one who, as far as Finian could tell in the dim light of the burning corpses, seemed to be wearing armor similar to Ser Donal's. "To what do we owe this timely arrival?" Finian decided to go with something simple, and not too incriminating. "We're looking for 2 of our friends. Percival and Alistair. Do you know them?" "The wardens." The knight nodded, waving a hand down toward the lake. "They left for the Circle Tower 3 days ago." "They left?" Khazar said incredulously, even as he swayed. "Was this before or after the undead started taking scenic evening strolls?" "After," the knight said uncertainly. "From what I understand, they're fetching something to stop, whatever it is that's causing these undead." "Leaving you undefended in the meantime," Mila said grimly. "It's not as bad now as it was before their arrival," the knight said quickly. "These attacks are manageable, at least." "Tell that to the man who just got thrown off a cliff," Khazar grumbled. The knight bowed his head in acknowledgement. "And our losses would no doubt have been worse if you had not intervened." He saluted. "I am Ser Perth, Knight of our Leman and leader of the village defenses. I am Finian Tabri, and these are Khazar, Mila, and Zevran. We're comrades of Alistair's and Percival's, and had hoped to find a bit of solace at Red Cliff. There's not much to be found here, I'm afraid. If you're with the wardens, you'll want to talk to Ban Tegan up at the castle. He glanced up the path. The road up there should be clear now. Once the waves stop, they rarely start again until the next night. Not that I'd expect you to have much trouble, in either case, after seeing that. He turned to look at Khazar in honest awe. Would that we'd had you at the beginning, mage. We'd never have sustained as many losses if we had. Yeah, Khazar muttered, still looking drained. I'm awesome. Tell me something I don't know. Thank you, Sir Perth, Finian said as the knight looked confused by the mage's response. We'll go talk to the ban. Will you be down in the village, if we need you? He nodded. Here until dawn, and then off to sleep before the next round tomorrow night. These days, most folks are sleeping down in the chantry. Joy, Khazar said. It's like Lothering all over again. Zevran arched a brow. Let us hope that this village does not meet a similar fate, yes? Particularly not while we are in it. We'll be fine, Finn said, starting up the path to the castle. Mila fell into step beside him, her eyes trained expertly on the path ahead, in case of trouble. Behind them, Khazar conjured a flame that seemed to be the only light for leagues in the gloaming. But, it was as the knight had said, no further waves of undead came. They reached the darkened castle gates only to find the courtyard inside abandoned. The door into the castle was broken inward, the heavy lock busted off and bits of wood clawed away. Finn swallowed, but resolutely stepped through. The white wolf had trailed after them most of the way, hackles still raised. Now, though, it completely refused to enter the building, instead electing to pace outside the door. Mila muttered something about agreeing with its distaste for stone walls, and Finn had to stifle a smile. He took the lead as they entered the foyer, his step light and his form flitting between shadows with the practice of a city-born thief. Mila was a good scout on the road, but this was Finn's element. He heard the creak of Zevran's leather armor off to one side, and turned to catch the crow winking at him from a nearby alcove before he slid into a shadow and disappeared. Zevran, too, it seemed, was passing familiar with how to sneak around a noble residence. Finn grinned, not to be outdone, and sank into the shadows behind a suit of armor, a feat that took a great deal of dexterity. Zevran's soft curse floated across the corridor, and Finn had to chuckle. Seriously? Must you two really do this now? Khazar's annoyed voice said from somewhere behind them, and both rogues burst out laughing. They vacated their hiding spots, and Finn couldn't help but share a look with Zevran. The spark in the crow's eyes promised that they'd pick up their little game later. All the sneaking around was unnecessary, anyway, as the place seemed to be abandoned. They entered what appeared to be a throne room, though the fancy draperies were tattered, and the floor was coated in dried blood. There was a battle here, Mila said unnecessarily. She cast her gaze around the floor, looking for something. But there are tracks going through the blood, something survived, and passed through this room several times afterward. Finn asked, was it undead? It is hard to say, though most of these tracks don't have the dragging gait of the corpses. She knelt down and traced a boot print. No, these are quick and steady. Someone survived. Can you track where they went? Finian asked hopefully. She nodded and stood. This way. She headed off through the entrance opposite the one they came in. Finn was about to follow her, but stopped when he noticed that Khazar wasn't moving. The mage was staring, wide-eyed, at one particularly large marking on the floor. From the circular shape, it looked like something had exploded there. Something bloody. Khazar. The mage started and looked up, his eyes blank. Then, he blinked and shook his head, as if dispelling some thought. I'm coming, keep your trousers on, Khazar grumped, starting after Mila. Who decided you could boss us around, anyway? Still, he followed without further protest, and the three followed Mila deeper into the castle. I, for one, am quite happy to have Finian boss me around, Zevran chuckled. Particularly with regards to trousers and the matter of whether they are on or not. Finn, can I fireball him? Just a little teeny one. No, Khazar. Despite the dire circumstances, Finn had to fight not to laugh. You cannot fireball our allies. Not without a healer on hand, anyway. A most practical decision, Warden, Zevran said cheerfully. Suck up, Khazar grumbled. They passed down a hall, and then through another broken door and up a staircase. Here, they did run into some resistance, in the form of a pair of skeletons in guard armor who seemed to be patrolling, of all things. These enemies were dispatched easily enough. Another corner, and they reached a room with a large, iron-lined door in one wall. Mila pointed to the door. That is where the tracks seem to lead. Finian wasn't surprised when he stepped forward and found the latch locked from the inside. This was a classic vault door, and would be no easy lock to break. The perfect challenge, as far as he was concerned. He stowed his daggers and opened up his lock-picking kit at his waist. Be ready, he advised as he knelt before the lock and got to work. We don't know whether they'll be friendly or not. Behind him, he heard the comforting creak of Mila drawing her bowstring, and smiled. It was dark in the castle corridors, so Finian had to operate mostly by feel. There were a good 5 tumblers, requiring a manual dexterity even he struggled to match. One of the tumblers was surprisingly stiff, and he broke a perfectly good pick before he found the right pressure to coax it into place. Finally, the lock clicked into place, and Finn sighed. He wiped the sweat off his brow and glanced behind him, happy to see all 3 companions ready for possible attack. Settling himself into a ready crouch, he opened the door. And ducked as a sword nearly took his head off. Zevran was there a moment later, sword and dagger both pressed to his rather surprised assailant's neck, an assailant dressed in guard armor. From inside the vault a man said, "Hold. It's just a couple elves." Ah, Zevran chuckled, I don't know if just is a word you truly wish to qualify that sentence with. Easy, Zevran, Finn said, sliding into the vault to stand behind the guard who'd nearly cut a foot off his height. He glanced around the room, hoping he looked non-threatening enough not to attack on sight, but still tough enough that they'd think twice before fighting him. A difficult posture to pull off, in all honesty. The vault was a small room, packed with shelves and armor stands. He saw a couple paintings and jewelry cases that made his fingers twitch a little, but he knew better than to snatch anything now, with a dozen eyes trained on him. The people packed into the little room looked ragged and tired, but no less willing to put up a fight if it came to it. Half of them were guards, 2 were elven servants, 1 was a man in chain armor, and 1 was an elderly human woman who leaned on a cane. There were also 2 people of particular interest. One was a woman in the bright, shiny garb that was apparently the current fashion among the nobility. The other was a gaunt man in tattered robes who sat in one corner, his hands tied together and 1 guard stationed practically on top of him. Is one of you Bantegan? Finn asked the room at large. That would be me, the man in chain said, stepping forward. Despite his lack of decoration, he had a certain regal bearing that spoke of nobility. Maybe Davith had a point. Nobles did have a certain way about them, didn't they? And who, if I may be so bold, are you? Finian sketched a bow as he heard his companions coming in behind him. I am Finian Tabri, and these are Mila, Zevran, and Dash. Khazar. That was from the gaunt man in the corner, whose eyes were suddenly very wide. In the blink of an eye, Khazar was in motion, launching a lightning bolt at the restrained man. The man rolled out of the way, obviously having expected the shot, and managed to scramble to his feet. As soon as he was on 2 legs, however, frost coalesced around his ankles and grew, encasing the lower half of his body in ice. Khazar stalked over, eyes livid, and smacked the other man soundly over the head with his staff. Then, the young elf glared. The other man cracked an eye open. That's it. What do you mean that's it? Khazar snapped. You want me to hit you again? I'd expected you to kill me, honestly. I should kill you, you son of a bitch. You almost got me made tranquil. Ah. This must be his blood mage friend from the tower. I know, the other mage said quietly, and I'm so sorry. I never meant for that to happen. You never do, Jowan, Khazar said, throwing his hands up in the air, but his temper had obviously faded to mere exasperation, so Finn didn't see the need to interrupt the reunion. Let me guess, you have something to do with this whole mess too, right? Despite not meaning to. This is all his fault, hissed the woman in noble's clothing, and Finn was surprised to hear an Orlshian accent out of her. He he seduced my Connor with his dark magic. Khazar snorted and turned an incredulous look to her. Lady, Jowan couldn't seduce a desire demon. Ouch, hurtful, Jowan said. Oh, deal with it you big baby. Perhaps, Finian said lightly, someone should start from the beginning. The ban cleared his throat. I'll try as best I can. And from there, he outlined the entire situation, Connor exhibiting magic, Jowan being hired to teach him, Eamon's poisoning by said apostate, followed by Connor's possession and the manifestation of an army of undead. Both Jowan and Lady Isolde, as that was apparently the Orlshian woman's name, broke in regularly to argue their sides, but they were swiftly silenced by the ban so he could continue his relatively neutral narration. During the ensuing flight, Ban Tegan finished, Connor fled, and the Blood Mage used his magic to free the rest of us. None of us wanted to go up and kill Connor, of course, so the only other option was suggested by the Blood Mage. He nodded toward Jowan, as if anyone would be confused about who he was referring to. He suggested a ritual that would send a mage to the Fade to confront the demon, since doing so would save Connor's life. The problem was, the ritual took a life to make that happen, and neither of the wardens were willing to allow that. That brute of a man wouldn't let us even try to save my Connor, Isolde said, near tears. Finn wondered who she was referring to as brute. So, the ban interrupted quickly, the wardens left for the Circle Tower, to gather enough lyrium to do the ritual without taking a life. Connor stayed quiet in his room for the day, and then the attacks started again that night. We have only managed to stay alive by locking ourselves in this vault every night. Meanwhile, Mila said disapprovingly, your fellows in your village fight for their lives to defend it against the creatures. It seems foolish to balk over one life when the needs of the clan are at stake. Yes, exactly. Isolde cried. I even volunteered. I would gladly give my life to save my sons. You still want to? Khazar asked, eyeing the woman thoughtfully. Because I could do it, if you do. At that, the woman burst into tears. Yes. Yes, I don't want my baby to suffer any longer. Ban Tegan frowned. Now, wait. Alistair and Percival could be back any day now. And for each of those any days, Finian said calmly, more of your men die. Each of them has families too, you know. Can you really look into their families' faces, knowing that you could have done something to save their father, their husband, or their son? All at the price of one life, freely given. The band's eyes flickered with doubt. Wait, Khazar said, turning narrow eyes on Finian. You're on board with this? You. Finn shrugged. She wants to save the one she loves. I say she deserves to be given that chance. It wasn't untruthful. First you approve of assassination, now blood sacrifice. If you ever endorse wholesale baby slaughter, I'm checking for demonic possession. Just so you know. I will consider myself warned. He turned back to Tegan, making his eyes carefully earnest. Grant him the power, make it his choice, so he would be less likely to change his mind. We won't do it without your permission, of course, my lord. But every moment you hesitate costs more innocent lives. It seems to me you've wasted so many of such moments already. You're right, the ban sighed, his head hanging. Eamon would never forgive me if I let his city fall. Oh, thank you Tegan. Isolde launched herself into the man's arms, weeping. Please, take care of them when I'm gone. I just want them to be happy and safe. Jowan, Khazar said in a business-like tone, how soon can you start the ritual? Within the hour, I think. The now-thawed Jowan smiled hesitantly at his fellow mage. Lady Isolde was most careful to keep my grimoire nearby, once she knew what I needed it for. And you didn't once try to take it and escape. Khazar scoffed. I'm rather ashamed of you. You're losing your touch. The human shrugged, his smile teasing. I guess Ban Tegan and Lady Isolde just don't invoke the same sort of panic that the prospect of a pissed-off Khazar Sirana did. Damn straight they don't. Finn watched the exchange with interest. It was easy to see why the pair had been and still were to some degree, by the looks of it, friends. Jowan's demeanor was unthreatening and soothing, which seemed to work well as a coolant for Khazar's notoriously hot temper. And still, That spark of gentle humor was exactly the sort of thing to offset Khazar's harsher cynicism. As Finn studied Khazar taking in his flippant remarks and the off-handed arrogance he exuded, the pickpocket came to the conclusion that the young mage was actually quite happy to see his friend. Of course, Khazar would never admit it out loud, and would likely happily turn anyone who suggested such a thing into an ice statue. Check the description for the links to the author.